It's 1985, and 15-year-old Michael Taylor is in Memphis for a few weeks to visit his father. It's a welcome change from the sleepy Arkansas town 3.5 hours away, where he lives with his mom and stepdad.
Michael was always a child that everybody loved.
There's Mike, guys. There we go.
All the girls wanted to be with Mike, and all the guys wanted to be Michael, you know.
All right. Let's go. Let's do it. Let's do it.
One afternoon, he's hanging with his Memphis friends at a local ice rink when a girl catches his eye.
That's when he actually met Pam, and he met her at the skating rink.
Who is that?
Pamela Gray is a star student at Memphis Catholic, a local private high school.
She loved to speed skate, so she did that as a hobby. Pam was very athletic as a teenager. She was very studious at school. She played softball. She made honor roll.
She's a beautiful girl.
Absolutely gorgeous and sweet, loving, caring. Always aimed to please the other person, never nothing for herself.
Can I join you?
If you can keep up.
They just fell in love at first sight, you know, and they were inseparable.
Before heading home to Arkansas, Mike calls his mom with a surprising request.
Hello?
Hey, Mom.
Hi, hon. You coming home?
Would you ever consider moving back to Memphis? I met this girl, Pam. That's not the only reason, though. I've been talking to schools, and Kingsbury actually wants me on their track and field team.
Michael, no.
I'm married. We're all living in Arkansas now. That's it.
He said, I've talked to several schools, and, you know, they're really interested in me coming here and pole vaulting and, you know, and doing all this stuff. And I'm like, no.
Okay, I'll just stay with Dad then.
You get
Home right now. Do you hear me?
right now.
The lovebirds settle for talking on the phone.
You have to convince your mom. Because, like, really, Kingsbury is the best for track and field.
I'm working on it.
I can't wait to see you again.
Me too. We'll figure it out. Don't worry about it.
When Mike gets his driver's license, he starts to shuttle back and forth.
Get in here.
He would just call me like every day, and he'd be like, Mom, please, just move down here. I don't want to be away from you. I want you to be here. And that was a 4-hour drive. So I was scared that something would happen, you know. And so finally one day I just told Ricky, who I was married to at the time, that I was moving to Memphis.
It works out well. Diane finds a better job in Memphis, and her husband, Ricky, joins the family a few months later.
Hey, I want to help, but I'm really late, okay? I love you. Bye.
They spent their time together mostly sports-related activities.
I love you, Pamela Gray.
I love you, Michael Taylor!
They were just perfect together as teenagers.
That's why it's a shock when they make a big announcement 4 years into the relationship.
Mom, what would you say if Pam was pregnant?
Well, I don't know. What would you say if Pam was pregnant?
I'm telling you she is.
I probably shouldn't have, but I was excited that I was going to have a grandbaby.
Congratulations.
Her family wasn't excited at all, which I can understand that.
Pam's mom, Peggy, had always hoped she would go off to college and get a job before starting a family. So when the teens talk marriage, she does her best to dissuade them.
Neither one of them had a job. They had no insurance.
What are you thinking?
We'll make it work, Miss.
If you do this, you'll have nothing.
Pam understood that she was still covered under my medical insurance. If she got married, she would be canceled off my insurance.
Instead of getting married, the couple gets their own apartment, and their little girl, Jennifer, is born.
And Pam was certainly excited. Mike was excited.
But the excitement doesn't last long. Soon, the reality of parenthood sets in.
The guys and I were actually planning on going out tonight, so I'm gonna go.
You're a father now. You can't just go out.
Don't tell me what to do.
They moved into an apartment, but he only stayed there maybe a month, and there was an argument the whole time. I mean, they always argued, you know.
Michael!
I'll see you later.
Mike went on and did what he wanted to do because he liked to play basketball and he liked to hang out with his friends, so he just kind of went his way, and she went her way.
Mike and Pam call it quits when Jennifer is still a baby. Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell see a young couple who may have bitten off more than they can chew.
Mike and Pam have a puppy love. They're drawn together, as many teenagers are, by infatuation, but they haven't really had enough time in life yet to figure out who they even are as individuals. So it's very hard at that age for them to really know what they want in a partner and to really sort of build the kind of long-term sustainable connection that you see more mature people make.
Things are going to be very hard for Mike and Pam now that they've split up and have a child. What a lot of people don't realize is once you have a child together, you're pretty much together forever. And so these two are going to have to find a way to get along and co-parent.
Months go by, then years. Both Pam and Mike get on with their lives and careers. And Pam's ability to manage motherhood with schooling and career becomes a source of pride.
Pam was a licensed practical nurse. She worked at Youth Villages, which is a home here in Memphis for children from broken homes or orphans, and she was well thought of.
Good morning.
How do you do it? You look great every morning.
Thank you.
Despite her busy schedule, she finds the time to take care of herself.
Morning.
Always had makeup on, no matter what time of day, no matter if she just got called in on the last moment. No hair out of place, just always like she just stepped out of a magazine to me. She was a very nice looking person.
And she more than finds the time to be a good mom.
So, how was this weekend? Oh, I didn't tell you. We were at a tournament in Nashville.
She was friendly and outgoing, though. She talked a lot about her and Jennifer. Jennifer was on a traveling basketball team, and I believe she went to a private school.
Meanwhile, Mike trains to be a welder and a heating and air conditioning repairman. He also joins several local sports teams.
I met Mike at the softball fields in Appling here in Memphis.
Hey, pitcher. Show me what you got, girl. Nice one, pitcher. Yeah!
Eventually, both Pam and Mike meet other people.
She married another man that was a police officer in Memphis.
He would wash dishes, do laundry, vacuum the floors. They had fun together.
Mike also marries.
He was sweet and caring. He was very good looking and fun to be around type of guy.
But he's a little tight-lipped when it comes to his ex-girlfriend.
He was very reluctant to really talk about Pam.
Maybe that's because their love story is far from over.
Pam and Mike was an on-again, off-again relationship for more than 20 years.
You're not going to do this to me again. If I can't have you, nobody else will.
school sweethearts Pam Gray and Mike Taylor split up almost as soon as their daughter is born. Years later, they've both married other people, though Pam's marriage to Reggie, a police officer, lasts less than a year.
The reason that I know that they split up and divorced was because he had some major legal issues that she just couldn't forgive him for or handle.
Those legal issues aren't minor. Reggie is charged with sexual assault for an incident from years before. He's sent to jail, and Pam feels both betrayed and horrified.
It was like it was all too good to be true, and it was too good to be true.
In the meantime, Mike has 2 more daughters with his wife, Wendy. He and Pam continue to share parenting duties for their daughter, Jennifer.
Jennifer spent most of the time with Pam. She had custody of Jennifer. Now, when Mike and I got married, it was more set every other weekend for Jennifer to come.
Look what I got for the birthday, girl.
Mike loves those visits more than anything.
And look.
He was a great father. He spent every minute he had with them.
Huh? You want to go play baseball later?
Pam doesn't like to be away from Jennifer either.
Yeah. Hi, Pam. Yeah, she's here.
So Pam would call for her. I didn't feel that it was hostile or anything like that at first.
But that changes. In 1998, Wendy and Mike call it quits.
Mike and I did have a time where we separated. And in fact, I had filed for divorce.
During the split, Mike and Wendy date other people. But just a few months later, they agree to give their marriage another chance.
I can't even tell you what happened, but we ended up back together. Both of us knew that we had dated someone else. We didn't know who. We had decided at that point we weren't going to talk about it.
Then Wendy finds out Mike's someone else was Pam.
Hello?
Hey, Wendy. Yeah, I heard
That you and Mike were back together.
Yeah.
Listen,
Between you and me, woman to woman, I think you should throw away those old...
old granny panties, maybe get some sexy lingerie. I bet you Mike would love that.
Excuse me, but I don't wear granny panties, and why the hell would Mike tell you anything anyway?
I mean, I don't know if I should tell you this, but...
Did you date
my husband?
It was really no big deal. And besides,
I'm really happy that you and Mike are back together.
And now at this point, I'm just hysterical because I'm thinking, now this is going to be so awkward.
Hey, babe.
You dated Pam when we were split up?
Wow. We went out a couple times. It's no big deal. I didn't tell her anything about our marriage. What'd she say?
And, he picks up the phone and calls her.
hey.
Van, it's Mike. Did you talk to Wendy?
No.
And she denied the entire conversation. At that point, I knew what I was dealing with. I said, that's it. And we're going to have to figure a way to co-parent without me having to run into her, because at this point, I might hurt her.
I don't want that woman in my house.
Got it.
Still, Mike has no choice but to see Pam.
Hey.
Hey. Just tell Jennifer I'll be in the car.
She's still out. Can I tempt you with a coffee?
Yeah, you can tempt me.
Since Mike and Pam had a child together, they would see each other every now and then, and it was not always comfortable.
Mike and Wendy divorce in 2002. They agree Wendy will have custody of their 2 daughters and Mike will have visitation. It's all surprisingly amicable.
I mean, we had great times and we enjoyed, each other. And then, in the end, we just grew apart.
A year goes by. Mike now has a stable job as a maintenance supervisor for an apartment complex. He plays the field.
That's how it's done.
In more ways than one.
Just like that.
Mike was very popular with the women, easy on the eyes, and all the girls thought he was a very nice-looking young man.
But Pam is not willing to let him go that easy.
Any plans this weekend?
Actually, I'm hoping Mike takes me to the casino.
Your ex, Mike?
Yeah, we keep in touch.
Since her divorce, Pam makes sure to take up all of Mike's time.
They went to Nashville to play golf one weekend. They just took several little short trips.
Then, for reasons known only to herself, Pam leaves her job and falls behind on rent.
She got evicted. I think they said she paid like too much rent there and lived there another 6 months and didn't pay anything.
Hey, Dad.
Hey, sweetie.
Jennifer, now 16, goes to stay with Mike, and Pam asks if she can crash there too.
Can I stay too?
Yeah, sure.
If that was Pam's plan all along, Mike doesn't see it that way. Nights turn into weeks, turn into months, and eventually, Pam and Mike admit to each other and to everyone else they're officially and exclusively a couple once again.
This is so awkward.
No, it isn't. It's not awkward at all. I think we're a family once more, so...
She told me that they was going to try to make another go of it. And I'm just like, honey, do with whatever you have in your heart.
I think he was just trying to give his oldest daughter, Jennifer, and Pam a family that maybe he realized they hadn't had an opportunity to have in previous years.
Just don't touch my bacon. Either of you touch my bacon and all bets are off, okay? I just want that known. No! Oh my God! Every time.
These two were bonded together originally by intense chemistry. And so I'm not really surprised that chemistry won and they ended up getting back together. If you're ever going to rush into a situation of living together again, this is the perfect scenario to do it. Mike's a nice guy. He's looking at Pam and his daughter, and they need help.
I would love to see this work out for Jennifer, because she has what all kids of divorce tend to fantasize about, her parents back together with her under the same roof. I think what we see here is Pam and Mike maybe rushing their reconciliation and moving in together sooner than they otherwise would have for this external reason. Pam's having a hard time affording housing. That always worries me about the ability of the commitment to stay.
Love is blind is true. Even when they were with
I do love you.
Other people, they truly loved one another.
I'm not going to minimize it. I mean, something was there. That's just the truth.
But can that something last?
Her husband was in a rage and was beating her.
What are you doing? Hey!
Their relationship, I can only classify it as volatile.
Former high school sweethearts Pam Gray and Mike Taylor are back together after 18 years apart. And after more than a year of living together in Memphis, the couple shocks everyone.
He said, well, Wynn, I just wanted to let you know that, Pam and I had, we got married. I said, have you lost your mind?
Pam and Mike have eloped while on vacation in Florida.
They didn't want any problems from family members, so did it their way.
And at that point, I'm thinking, you know, maybe she's changed. Maybe they were true love from the beginning and they're supposed to be together. Who knows?
Mike adds Pam to his benefits package and life insurance policy, and at her request, agrees to move to a more upscale apartment.
They were living together, and the apartments that he lived at, he also worked at. But these apartments weren't good enough for her.
I love it.
Pam's requests don't stop there.
Mike would go up to the pool on his off days and sit out in the sun, and he was someone who worked out and was attractive, and he'd draw attention of females. But Pam would get very jealous and get very angry.
There are other elements of Mike's lifestyle that Pam does not approve of.
I hate to say this, but Mike did steroids and stuff. He did, because he was a buff. He liked to work out.
I was with Mike for probably 4 to 5 years during cycles that he would take of steroids. During the summer, he had a hard time keeping weight on because he was really skinny.
It's something he's done on and off for years, and it makes Pam crazy.
Unbelievable!
Hey! What are you doing?
You know what those things do to you? They make you crazy!
I can do whatever I want.
With Mike, it was my way or the highway. You know, it was, I'm not going to stop and I'm not going to change.
This is what you're spending all of our money on!
Mike has some complaints of his own.
You know what, Pam? You know what we can't afford? You sending Jen and her friends to Florida. Or all of your shopping sprees. Or the, hey, Mike, I forgot to pay the bills.
Her finances were a mess, and she spent.
You're incredible.
Though she's found work with a placement agency, it's not permanent, and Mike insists she's living beyond her means.
For example, if Jennifer had a prom to go to, it wouldn't be the dress she could afford, it would be her entire paycheck dress, and then something wouldn't get paid.
And the problems with her finances don't stop there. One afternoon, Mike's at home when a strange man comes by.
The man said, I'm looking for Pamela Gray. And Mike said, well, she's Pamela Taylor. She's my wife. And he said, well, she's got a car that we've been trying to repossess for years now, and we've just now found it. He was very angry.
And that's not Pam's only debt.
Another great debt that she had was St. Benedict's School. He found out the day that Jennifer didn't get her diploma. We were at graduation, and he found out then because when he opened up her, you know, they come in a little thing, and when he opened it up, there was none in there, and he was very angry. School showed them $14,700, and what she told Michael she owed them was $2,000, and she had made arrangements with it to pay them, but she hadn't. And after that was when everything started going downhill.
Both Pam and Mike have some extreme behaviors. Pam has a spending issue and Mike has a steroid issue, and the combination of those two things can be real problems for their relationship.
Pam actually has some reasonable concerns about Mike's behavior. When you're a committed husband and father, you can't do as many of the things outside of the house that your family, your spouse are not involved in as you can when you're a single man. On top of that, the steroids can have all kinds of profound negative physiological and psychological effects. If Mike is using steroids any other way than by prescription as directed by a physician, Pam has every reason to be concerned.
Friends and family members say the tension between the two becomes very palpable.
For example, if he was playing a video game and lost, he would throw the remote control at the TV set.
A big piece of crap!
Would you calm down? It's just a stupid game.
Mike had rages. He had plenty of rages. And he always got on his Xbox and got mad at rage. He'd spit on the TV over a game.
The rages don't stop at the home.
When he was playing golf, if the ball didn't go where he wanted it to go, he'd break golf clubs.
One incident that we talked about frequently was him throwing a golf club against a tree.
Pamela always, if she acted submissive, she could get him to calm down. And she always thought that there was a way to help Michael.
But there isn't any helping this doomed love affair.
She was in the bed asleep. And he came in that door, knocking furniture over, hollering, "Bitch, are you ready to die?"
Months after Mike and Pam Taylor elope, their reloaded romance is already on the rocks. He says she spends too much. She says he's got a temper.
Ow! Ow, please stop it! Stop it! Please!
They argue more and more. One morning, the couple's daughter, Jennifer, learns that something is very wrong.
Please, my husband! He's hitting me! Ow!
Pam made a 911 call saying that her husband and her were fighting. She started yelling.
But by the time police arrive, Pam is alone and the altercation appears to be over.
Hi.
Yeah, we received a call about a...
Police came to the scene and he talked a bit, looked in the house. "Are you sure you feel okay staying here?" And she said yes, and he left.
Are you sure you'll be all right on your own?
Pam doesn't press charges.
Really, thanks.
Things are really escalating between this couple. He's aggressive with a golf club and his video games, and there's now this 911 call.
Even if it's just destroying inanimate objects, punching walls, whatever people do, can escalate to violence against other people in the house.
Possible scenarios are that this couple just can flip the switch. That one minute they can be really intense and the next minute they can have a smile on their faces and be relaxed. Well, the fact is, Pam and Mike are not good relationship material.
Later that night, Mike confides in a friend that all is not well on the home front.
Good game today, man.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted.
They were drinking beer. He was hanging out, and he was telling Tim, who was his good friend, that he was just tired and getting depressed over trying to keep Pam happy, keep their daughter happy, keep everything together.
Stay at my place, man. Spare room. Take a little break from her. Best thing you can do. Yeah. I gotta go. You gotta...
Jennifer decides to stay with a friend. Pam lets her know everything's okay. But it's not. Early on December 23, 2009, police receive another 911 call from the Taylor residence.
When they got to the scene, Pam let them in. She was very silent to herself, and she sat on the couch. There were some chairs turned over in the apartment, in which she said there was a struggle. He was dead on the scene. He was DOA.
Mike was shot in the heart and then once in the back of the head, right behind his right ear.
Mike's mother hears about the tragedy on the news.
When that happened, when I heard it, I just passed out. That's all I remember.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I was driving home, and a friend of ours called and, "Rita, do you know that Michael Taylor was killed today?" It was a shock. I couldn't believe it.
Pam says she can scarcely believe it either when she describes the tragic sequence of events that led to his death. She begins her story with Mike coming home the previous night after their big fight.
Now, they did not sleep in the same bed that night. She went to sleep in the room that was used by their daughter. And so when he came back from Tim's apartment, he just went on into their bedroom. He didn't disturb her, and he just went to sleep.
Then in the morning, Mike goes out before she wakes up. But when he comes home a little while later, the trouble begins.
Bitch! Where are you, bitch? Come out here!
He came in that door, knocking furniture over, hollering, "Bitch, are you ready to die? You're dying today, bitch."
Huh? Where are you, bitch? Get the hell out of here! Come here, bitch! Today's the day you die! Come here! Come here! Get on the floor! Get on the floor! Get on the floor! Stay on the floor! Come here! Look! Here, we're down. All right? Just relax. Okay? There's nothing you got.
Her story to the police was that he was using drugs, he was using Lortabs and steroids and smoking pot, and she was scared and she shot him.
Pam says she bought the gun to protect herself and only pointed it at Mike to threaten him. She doesn't remember pulling the trigger.
She told me, she said, "Mom, you'll never know how much and how badly you want to live till you know you're going to die."
When there's been a history of 911 calls to a family's house for domestic violence or alleged domestic violence, it's not surprising for there to be another call. These things tend to be cyclical. And so it's possible that some more domestic violence happened. In this case, it was lethal.
The police begin their investigation. Was Mike in some kind of drug-induced rage? Toxicology reports confirm Mike has used drugs in recent weeks or months.
There were only 2 drugs found in his system that he could have been under the influence of. And one of them was cannabis, which of course is a derivative of marijuana. That's not considered an aggressive drug. He had steroids in his system, but it wasn't such an unusual amount as to cause what one would think would be steroidal rage.
The results are deemed inconclusive. As Mike's body is put to rest, his friends and family struggle to understand how he could have died at the hands of his first love.
Lots of talk about, how could she do this?
It's the same question that police are asking.
My daughter didn't kill or murder Michael. My daughter saved her own life.
Mike would never put his hands on anybody, and there's nobody in this world that would ever convince me that that was the kind of person he was.
Mike Taylor, 39, is dead at the hands of his wife, Pamela. But she says she was acting in self-defense. Police entertain the possibility until they find holes in Pamela Taylor's story.
When they got to the murder scene, furniture was turned over, but it looked just like that. It was turned over. It wasn't flung or thrown. It looked like a staged scene, according to the police.
It was Christmas time, and they had some nice little Christmas decorations, but none of the nice and pretty decorations were broken.
Pam claims to have been attacked, but her hair looks as perfect as always.
She looked just fine. She really did.
Then there's the real damning evidence. A receipt from a pawn shop.
The day before the shooting, she took her engagement ring and some other jewelry and went to a pawn shop and pawned it. I think she got $350 for it.
Just down the street from the pawn shop is a popular local gun shop where one would be likely to go next to get a brand new gun. And there were the records of her buying a brand new gun and enough bullets, for at least one round.
This was less than 24 hours before the killing.
October 14th, 2010, Pam Taylor, 38, is charged with first-degree murder. At the trial, prosecutors say it was Pam, not Mike, who was angry and unstable, triggered by him asking for a divorce.
He was in the process of going through the paperwork and removing Pam as the beneficiary of any health policies. Basically, he had already made plans to move. He'd already taken away his television. The man's not far behind his big screen TV. That's my experience. He moves that out, he's gone.
Why are you doing this?
Just moving some stuff to my mom's.
You don't live at your mom's. You live here.
And she knew that was coming, and she just was thinking, you're not going to do this to me again. If I can't have you, nobody else will.
As for Mike's violent outbursts, prosecutors contend they were always against property, not people.
He hit a tree with his golf club one time, but he didn't wrap it around her head or break anybody's property. He just broke it, so he didn't hurt anybody but himself, because then he had to go out and buy another one,
Mike would never put his hands on anybody, and there's nobody in this world that would ever convince me that that was the kind of person he was.
Everyone who spoke to me, who I spoke with about Mike, described him as a very nice, kind person, not as someone who was violent.
When Pam called 911 on December 22nd, the day before the murder, there was no indication of a struggle.
She received this call from this lady, and she was saying, "Ouch, ouch, my husband, he's hitting me. Oh, don't do that, it hurts.
Ow, please, my husband, he's hitting me. Ow."
And she said, and I thought, this is really weird, because when you take a domestic violence call, and I've taken many of them, she said, you hear people throwing things and screaming.
Prosecutors argue Pam's first 911 call was intended to set up a battered woman's defense.
It was the only voice they could hear there. And the officer who made the scene thought it was quite unusual, because when he got there, she came out to meet him and nothing looked wrong. She had no bruises, no indications of a struggle, nothing of that nature. And they checked, and Mike was at work.
The morning of December 23rd, Mike leaves the house early to go to the dentist. But if he's in a drug-addled homicidal rage, the dentist doesn't notice.
We went out to speak with her. She described him as a pleasant patient who was always happy and in a good mood.
When Mike returns home that morning, he finds Pam up and dressed. What he doesn't know is that she's got something up her sleeve, literally.
He went in the bathroom, and she came up and surprised him.
Mike?
Yeah, Pam. What are you doing? Pam, what are you doing?
If someone's coming at you, it's highly irregular to shoot them in the back of the head. Chest, maybe. Back of the head, not so much.
If you were going to tell someone, here are the tips to make it look like you killed someone in self-defense, it would be like step 1. make it look like they're a domestic abuser. Step 2, call 911. Step 3, get a gun and have it ready so it looks like you're prepared in self-defense. And so it really does look like it's a contrived story and not a real one.
The number one defense to murder is, I didn't do it. The second most common defense is, well, I did it, but I had to do it in some kind of self-defense. And anytime that is true, it tends to be a very straightforward scenario. Anytime there starts to be things about the story that are inconsistent, things that seem to be changing, things that seem to be implausible, it creates a high suspicion in me as a forensic psychologist that this is a bogus self-defense story.
Pam's family maintains her innocence.
I want people to know the truth. My daughter didn't kill or murder Michael. My daughter saved her own life.
But a judge and 12 jurors disagree. And Pamela Taylor, at the age of 40, is convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 21 years in prison without parole.
They found that this woman had killed an innocent guy and that she did it intentionally or knowingly. Michael was not the aggressor. Pam was. And Pam knew what she was doing.
For Mike's friends and family, there is no justice.
Mike didn't deserve what happened to him. No one's perfect, and he had his flaws. We all did. But he definitely did not deserve what happened to him. He was a good guy.
It was pretty gut-wrenching, and every time we step on the softball field, it's a reminder that we miss Michael and that it didn't have to happen. She took a dad from 3 children. She took a friend, she took a son, and she just plain took a good person for absolutely no reason other than self-centered jealousy.
Her mother can still go and see her. Her daughter can still go and see her, but I can't see my son.
The open ocean is a place devoid of memory. It holds no monuments, leaves no footprints, and swallows every scream with an absolute, terrifying indifference. When you are standing on the deck of a ship, surrounded by the unfathomable expanse of the Pacific, the horizon becomes a physical weight. There is no east or west, no north or south that the naked eye can distinguish, only the crushing reality of water meeting sky in a continuous, unbroken loop. This is an isolation so profound that it begins to alter the human mind. The rules of dry land, the invisible social contracts that bind civilized society together, slowly dissolve in the salt air. Out here, survival is the only currency, and morality often ends where the deep water begins. It was March of the year 2001. The waters hundreds of nautical miles to the north of Pago Pago, American Samoa, were as unforgiving as they were vast. Pago Pago itself is a harbor town, a sanctuary carved into a volcanic crater, offering refuge and civilization in the heart of the South Pacific. But the safety of that port was a world away from the reality unfolding on the open sea. Hundreds of miles north of that safe harbor, the ocean is not a tropical paradise. It is an industrial workplace, a desolate expanse where men extract life from the depths under grueling conditions. There are no emergency services out here. No police cruisers waiting around the corner. No neighbors to hear a cry for help. If something goes wrong, the nearest assistance is days away, assuming a distress call can even be made. Navigating this void was the OMAC, an industrial fishing vessel. The term vessel often evokes romantic imagery of sailing ships and ocean liners, but the OMAC was nothing of the sort. It was a floating slaughterhouse, a mechanical predator designed for one singular purpose: to harvest the ocean with maximum efficiency. It was a structure of cold, rusting steel, scarred by the corrosive kiss of saltwater and the brutal wear and tear of continuous, punishing labor. To understand the events that would eventually unfold on this ship, one must first understand the physical reality of existing inside it. The environment aboard the OMAC was an assault on the human senses. The air was thick, heavy, and saturated with the inescapable, nauseating stench of processed fish, old blood, and cheap diesel fuel. This odor did not just linger in the air, it permeated everything. It seeped into the fabric of the crew's clothing, burrowed into their skin, and coated the very walls of the narrow corridors. Breathing was not a relief, but a constant reminder of the grim reality of their environment. Accompanying this oppressive smell was the noise. The heart of the OMAC was its massive industrial engine, a beast of machinery that never slept. The engine produced a deafening, rhythmic rumbling that reverberated through every steel plate, every bulkhead, and every floorboard of the ship. It was a continuous, bone-rattling vibration that made silence an absolute impossibility. The crew lived inside this mechanical roar day and night. It made conversation difficult and sleep even harder. The relentless grinding noise wore away at the nerves, acting as a slow, invisible form of psychological torture that frayed the edges of a man's sanity. The ship was a labyrinth of confined spaces. There were no wide-open decks for leisure, no spacious quarters for rest. Every square inch of the OMAC was optimized for the harvest, leaving the crew to inhabit the cramped, claustrophobic margins. The corridors were narrow, poorly lit, and perpetually slick with a mixture of seawater, fish slime, and oil. Navigating these passageways required constant vigilance, a physical tension just to maintain balance. The sleeping quarters were little more than metal cages, stacked closely together, offering zero privacy and barely enough room to turn around. In this environment, personal space did not exist. The men were packed together like the very cargo they were pulling from the sea, constantly in each other's way, constantly breathing down each other's necks. This extreme physical confinement was the crucible in which a highly volatile human element was forced to interact. The crew of the OMAC was a mixed group, a tapestry of nationalities brought together by economic necessity. The hierarchy on board was rigidly defined and starkly divided. At the top of the command structure were the Korean officers and managers. They held the power, the authority, and the responsibility for the ship's yield. Beneath them, performing the grueling, backbreaking physical labor, were the deckhands, a mixed group of Vietnamese and Indonesian men. This division of labor was complicated exponentially by a profound and impenetrable language barrier. In an environment that requires precise coordination and clear communication to avoid injury or death, the inability to speak a common tongue was a catastrophic liability. The Korean management, the Vietnamese laborers, and the Indonesian deckhands were trapped together, yet completely isolated from one another in their own linguistic silos. Commands were often barked in a language the laborers did not understand, leading to confusion, mistakes, and inevitable frustration. When words fail, human beings resort to volume and physical gestures. What might have been a simple instruction could easily be interpreted as a threat. What might have been a minor correction often felt like a profound insult. The silence between the groups bred suspicion. When men cannot talk to each other, they watch each other. They interpret glances, analyze body language, and project their own fears onto the faces of strangers. The Vietnamese and Indonesian crew members, exhausted and pushed to their physical limits, could not voice their grievances or negotiate their conditions. They could only endure. And there was much to endure. The data from the subsequent investigations points to a dark reality aboard the OMAC, a pervasive culture of mistreatment. The laborers were subjected to harsh, unyielding discipline from their superiors. The pressure to maintain production, to keep the holds full, cascaded down the hierarchy, manifesting as abuse directed at the lowest men on the ladder. The Vietnamese crew members, in particular, found themselves at the receiving end of this systemic cruelty. They were overworked, their bodies pushed beyond exhaustion in the hazardous, slippery environment of the processing deck. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological damage was far worse. To be trapped in a steel box, thousands of miles from home, performing dangerous labor while being constantly berated by men you cannot understand, is a recipe for the systematic destruction of the human spirit. The mistreatment was not just an occasional outburst. It became the baseline reality of their existence. The officers, operating under the assumption of absolute authority in international waters, ruled through intimidation. They weaponized the isolation of the ocean, knowing that the crew had nowhere to go, no authorities to appeal to, and no means of escape. Under these conditions, the minor conflicts that inevitably arise in tight quarters did not simply resolve. They festered, a shoulder bumped in a narrow, dark hallway, a misplaced tool on the slippery deck, a harsh word shouted over the deafening roar of the engine. In a normal environment, these would be fleeting moments of annoyance. On the OMAC, they were sparks falling onto dry tinder. The tension became a tangible, heavy presence in the air, thicker than the smell of the diesel fumes. The psychological state of the crew began to shift. The despair of being trapped gave way to a cold, simmering resentment. The laborers were stripped of their agency, treated not as men, but as expendable components of the ship's machinery. When a human being is pushed into a corner, completely stripped of their dignity and deprived of any legal or physical avenue for redress, the primitive instincts of survival take over. The logical, rational mind is bypassed, replaced by a desperate, instinctual drive to eliminate the source of the threat. The OMAC was no longer just a fishing vessel. It was a floating pressure cooker with a locked valve. The fire underneath was the relentless abuse, the impenetrable language barrier, and the agonizing physical conditions. The pressure inside was the collective, unspoken fury of the Vietnamese crew. And all around them, acting as the ultimate containment vessel, was the endless, dark water of the Pacific Ocean. There was no single, defining moment that broke the camel's back. It was the accumulation of 1,000 indignities, the weight of 100 sleepless nights listening to the engine roar, and the sharp sting of unpunished abuse. The mind, when subjected to continuous trauma without the possibility of escape, will eventually fracture. It will stop looking for a way out and start looking for a way to fight back. The distinction between a laborer and a captive became blurred, and in the minds of the oppressed, the ship transformed from a workplace into a prison. As March dragged on, the atmosphere on board grew increasingly toxic. The officers maintained their brutal regime, seemingly unaware or unconcerned by the dark shift in the men below them. Perhaps they believed the language barrier and the absolute isolation of the ocean would keep the men docile. Perhaps they underestimated the capacity for violence that resides in men who feel they have absolutely nothing left to lose. Nighttime on the open ocean is a darkness that is difficult to comprehend. It is absolute. The sky and the water merge into a single, impenetrable void of black. Inside the OMAC, the artificial lights cast long, distorted shadows down the narrow corridors, making the wet steel look like the walls of a cavern. The sound of the engine throbbed like a mechanical heartbeat, steady and indifferent. It was in this environment, under the cover of this absolute darkness, that the breaking point was finally reached. The minor squabbles and the underlying psychological tension had fully crystallized. The bomb that had been slowly constructed over weeks of mistreatment and miscommunication was now primed. The Vietnamese crew, isolated by language but united by their suffering, reached a terrifying consensus. The rules of the surface world no longer applied to them. The hierarchy that governed the ship was no longer recognized. There would be no strike, no formal grievance filed, and no attempt to contact the authorities. The ocean had taught them that no one was coming to save them. If they were to survive the physical and mental torment inflicted upon them, they would have to save themselves. And in the dark, cramped, foul-smelling bowls of the OMAC, survival meant only one thing. It meant taking control. It meant turning the very tools of their backbreaking labor into instruments of retribution. As the Korean officers slept, or perhaps as they stood watch in the dim light of the bridge, unaware of the shift in the balance of power, the laborers made their choice. The isolation of the Pacific Ocean was about to witness a sudden, explosive return to the most primitive, violent nature of humanity. The ship, already stained with the blood of its daily harvest, was about to be baptized in a completely different kind of violence. The tragedy of the OMAC is not just a story of a mutiny. It is a terrifying study of the human condition under extreme duress. It forces us to ask unsettling questions about what we are capable of when stripped of society's protective layers. When the laws of the land fade away, and a man is left alone with his oppressors in an inescapable metal box, where does self-defense end and murder begin? The events that transpired next were not born of cold, calculated malice, but of a desperate, terrifying claustrophobia. The decision to act was driven by the primal fear of men who felt they were already drowning long before they ever touched the water. The stage was set, the weapons were already in their hands, and the vast, uncaring ocean would serve as the only witness to the horror that was about to unfold. The OMAC was sailing steadily toward its doom, carrying a cargo of rage that was finally ready to spill over into the dark, churning waters of the Pacific. To understand the exact nature of the horrific violence that would consume the OMAC, one must carefully examine the profile of the victims and the extreme environment that dictated their behavior. The victims in this tragedy were the Korean officers and managers, the men tasked with commanding a vessel hundreds of nautical miles north of Pago Pago, American Samoa. To simply label them as casualties of a sudden, unprovoked attack is to ignore the complex, volatile ecosystem of commercial deep-sea fishing. On a vessel like the OMAC, humanity is rapidly stripped away by economic necessity. These Korean officers were not born into cruelty. They were middle managers operating within one of the most brutal, unregulated, and high-pressure industries on the planet. They were sent out into the desolate expanse of the Pacific Ocean with a singular, unforgiving mandate: fill the holds of the ship with fish at all costs. The economic reality of commercial fishing is a crushing weight. The officers carried the entire financial burden of the expedition on their shoulders. If the nets came up empty, if the quotas were not met, it was the officers who faced professional and financial ruin upon their return to port. This immense pressure created a toxic environment where empathy was viewed as a fatal operational weakness. The officers on the OMAC were separated from their crew by a vast cultural divide, but more importantly, by an impenetrable wall of authority and language. They were Korean men managing a grueling workforce comprised entirely of Vietnamese and Indonesian laborers. In the rigidly hierarchical world of international deep-sea fishing, this structure is by design. It is implemented to keep labor costs artificially low while maintaining absolute, unquestioned operational control over the vessel. However, this structure also breeds a profound and dangerous alienation. The Korean officers likely viewed the deckhands not as individual human beings with breaking points, but as biological extensions of the ship's mechanical systems. When a machine on a factory floor breaks down, you force it to work. You repair it forcefully, you bypass its safety limits, and you do whatever is strictly necessary to keep the production line moving. The severe abuse detailed in the subsequent maritime investigations, the harsh treatment, the constant physical reprimands, and the relentless driving of exhausted men was the direct manifestation of this extreme, top-down pressure. The Korean officers operated in a complete vacuum of accountability. Out on the high seas, surrounded by nothing but the vast, indifferent water of the Pacific Ocean, they were the absolute law of the land. There were no labor inspectors to audit their shifts, no human resources departments to receive grievances, and no maritime police to monitor their daily behavior. Authority, when completely unchecked and combined with the extreme stress of deep-water navigation, inevitably corrupts the human spirit. The officers began to rely entirely on intimidation and physical dominance as their primary tools of management. The language barrier, a profound obstacle to any genuine human connection or conflict resolution, only exacerbated this dangerous dynamic. Because the officers could not communicate complex instructions, explain the reasons for their demands, or offer basic words of encouragement, they resorted to the universal, primitive language of violence and fear. Yet, to simply categorize the victims as one-dimensional villains is to fundamentally misunderstand the tragedy of the OMAC. These Korean officers were also trapped in their own way. They were prisoners of the same rusted steel hull, breathing the exact same diesel-choked air, and enduring the same relentless, bone-rattling vibrations of the massive industrial engine. They were thousands of miles away from their own families, isolated in a hostile and unforgiving environment, tasked with a highly dangerous and physically exhausting job. Their slightly elevated status on the ship provided them with marginally better living conditions, perhaps a designated cabin with a door that closed, or slightly larger rations of food, but it also painted a massive, inescapable target on their backs. They were the highly visible face of the crew's daily suffering. Every ache in the muscles of a Vietnamese laborer, every drop of blood spilled on the slippery processing deck, and every moment of suffocating homesickness was directly attributed to the Korean men issuing the relentless orders from above. The physical layout of the OMAC played a critical, enabling role in the impending disaster, creating a fatal false sense of security for the officers. The industrial ship was divided into distinct, segregated zones. The lower decks, where the heavy, exceptionally dangerous work of sorting and processing the catch took place, were a chaotic nightmare of sharp implements, heavy machinery, and constant, freezing ocean spray. This was the inescapable domain of the laborers. Above them, separated by steep metal staircases and heavy watertight doors, were the bridge and the officers' private quarters. This vertical separation was a stark physical manifestation of the ship's social hierarchy. The officers slept in areas that were slightly removed from the absolute worst of the noise and the nauseating stench of the catch. When they retreated to their cabins after a grueling shift, they closed their heavy metal doors, effectively and deliberately shutting out the misery and the murmurs of the exhausted men below them. This physical and psychological separation fostered a deadly blindness among the command staff. The officers, feeling secure in their isolated positions of power, completely failed to read the rising temperature of the ship. They tragically mistook the forced silence of the Vietnamese crew for passive submission. In the high-stakes, dangerous environment of commercial fishing, instant obedience is demanded to prevent accidents, and the laborers had indeed been obedient. They had worked through the crushing exhaustion, silently endured the physical abuse, and performed the brutal, repetitive tasks assigned to them day after day. To the Korean managers looking down from the elevated safety of the bridge, the system appeared to be functioning exactly as the fishing company had designed it. They saw bodies moving in rhythm with the machinery, hauling the heavy nets, gutting the fish, and filling the freezing holds. What they could not see, because they never bothered to look past the language barrier and their own ingrained prejudice, was the slow, methodical hardening of human hearts taking place right beneath their feet. The concept of a maritime mutiny is often associated with grand, cinematic declarations of defiance, but the grim reality on the OMAC was far more insidious and quiet. The anger among the Vietnamese laborers was a suffocating, dense entity, growing heavier and more volatile with every passing hour of abuse. The officers, heavily insulated by their absolute authority and their segregated living spaces, were entirely oblivious to the terrifying fact that they were sleeping directly on top of a highly explosive powder keg. They went about their daily maritime routines, charting navigation courses, monitoring the deep water sonar, and enforcing the strict catch quotas, completely unaware that their very existence had become an intolerable provocation to the men they commanded. The environment of the open ocean amplified this extremely dangerous dynamic to a lethal degree. Hundreds of miles north of Pago Pago, the concept of rescue or external intervention is a purely theoretical abstraction. American Samoa, despite being a territory of the United States with a robust federal legal system, was practically on another planet. Pago Pago is home to massive tuna canneries, serving as the final destination for the bloody, exhausting work done on industrial ships like the OMAC. The port town is accustomed to the rough, hardened nature of the deep-sea fishing industry, but the authorities on land only see the profitable results of the voyage, never the grim, violent reality of the journey itself. The officers on the OMAC knew that whatever happened out in the deep water stayed hidden in the deep water. They fundamentally believed that the vast isolation of the Pacific Ocean was their ultimate, impenetrable shield, guaranteeing that their brutal management methods would never be scrutinized by the outside world or a court of law. This absolute belief in their own intouchability was their fatal flaw. They failed to realize that the exact same isolation that protected them from the scrutiny of maritime law also protected the laborers from the immediate consequences of a violent rebellion. If there is no police force to stop an abusive manager from beating a deckhand, there is also no police force to stop a desperate, vengeful crew from slaughtering that manager. The open ocean is an equalizer in the most terrifying, primal sense of the word. It rapidly strips away job titles, bank accounts, and societal status, leaving only the raw, fundamental elements of biological survival. In that stripped-down, brutal reality, a man holding a clipboard and a managerial title is infinitely more vulnerable than a desperate man holding a rusted fish knife with absolutely nothing left to lose. As the days dragged into weeks, the punishing rhythm of life on the Omak became a grim countdown to the inevitable explosion. The Korean officers continued to push their men past the point of human endurance, completely blind to the fact that they were pushing against a structural wall that was ready to violently collapse inward. The psychological profile of the victims in this narrative is entirely defined by their tragic hubris. They genuinely believed that the fear they had violently instilled in the laborers was far stronger than the laborers' innate will to survive. They believed that the locked metal bulkheads of their sleeping cabins could keep the physical consequences of their actions safely at bay. They believed that the established, traditional order of the maritime industry would somehow miraculously protect them from the primal, unwritten laws of human nature. They were catastrophically wrong on every single count. The very tools they provided to the crew to harvest the ocean the heavy, razor-sharp meat cleavers used to instantly sever the heads of massive tuna, and the long, vicious iron hooks used to drag the heavy, bloody carcasses across the slippery processing deck were about to be horrifyingly repurposed. The officers, in their blind, relentless pursuit of profit and industrial efficiency, had inadvertently armed their own executioners. The laborers did not need to smuggle firearms aboard. The ship itself was a floating armory of industrial butchery. The officers had created a horrific environment where the crew handled lethal, heavy instruments every single day, becoming intimately and dangerously familiar with exactly how much physical force was required to cut through dense bone and thick sinew. The sheer isolation of their geographical position cannot be overstated in this context. When a vessel is operating hundreds of nautical miles north of American Samoa, it has effectively removed itself from the entire safety net of modern human civilization. If an emergency distress signal were somehow successfully transmitted from the bridge, the response time from the Coast Guard would not be measured in minutes or hours, but in days. The Korean officers knew this implicitly, relying heavily on this deep-sea isolation to mask their brutal, illegal management style. Yet, in their supreme arrogance, they failed to recognize that this exact same isolation would act as their ultimate undoing. They had built a kingdom of absolute fear on a floating, rusted island of steel, completely disconnected from the moral, ethical, and legal frameworks that govern basic human interaction on dry land. By systematically stripping the Vietnamese deckhands of their basic human dignity and treating them as nothing more than expendable beasts of burden, the officers had inadvertently stripped away the very social contracts that kept them safe in their own beds at night. The exact moment the laborers collectively realized that the brutal law of the ocean was the only law that actually applied to their existence, the artificial authority of the Korean management evaporated instantly and permanently. In the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of the Pacific night, the commercial fishing vessel was no longer a structured corporate enterprise. It had rapidly regressed into a primitive, blood-soaked arena of raw survival where the desperate men who held the sharpest blades and harbored the deepest, most justified resentments would violently dictate the final, horrific terms of the voyage. The descent into absolute violence does not occur in a vacuum. It requires a specific set of environmental and psychological conditions to erode the final barriers of human restraint. On that fateful night in March of 2001, the Omak provided the perfect incubator for this horrifying transformation. The sun had long since dipped beneath the rim of the Pacific, plunging the industrial fishing vessel into a profound and suffocating darkness. In the vast expanse of the open ocean, night is not merely the absence of light. It is a physical entity, a heavy, oppressive blanket that isolates the ship from the rest of the universe. The only illumination came from the harsh, flickering fluorescent bulbs strung along the exterior rigging and the dim, utilitarian lights illuminating the narrow, rusted corridors inside the hull. Below the main deck, the massive industrial engine continued its relentless, deafening mechanical heartbeat, vibrating through the steel plates and masking the subtle sounds of human movement. It was within this sensory void, under the cover of the engine's roar and the ocean's absolute isolation, that the breaking point was finally reached. For weeks, the tension aboard the OMAC had been building, compressing like a tightly coiled spring under the weight of continuous physical exhaustion and unchecked abuse. The Vietnamese laborers, pushed entirely beyond the limits of human endurance by the Korean management, had silently reached a terrifying consensus. The exact moment of ignition remains obscured by the chaos that followed, but the mechanism of the uprising was brutally simple. There was no grand declaration, no formal mutiny organized with manifestos or demands. The transition from submission to slaughter was fluid, born out of a collective, desperate instinct for survival. The laborers did not need to formulate a complex tactical plan. They simply needed to turn the grim reality of their daily existence against their tormentors. The processing deck, usually a site of grueling, repetitive labor, suddenly transformed into an armory. The men reached for the familiar tools of their trade, instruments designed for the efficient butchery of massive marine life. They armed themselves with heavy, rust-pitted meat cleavers, long filleting knives honed to razor sharpness, and the vicious, heavy iron hooks used to drag massive tuna carcasses across the slippery decks. In the hands of desperate men, these tools of industry instantly became weapons of horrific, intimate violence. The sheer physicality of these weapons dictated the brutal nature of the impending attack. There were no firearms aboard the OMAC, no clean, detached methods of inflicting lethal harm from a distance. To kill with a cleaver or an iron hook requires proximity, immense physical force, and an absolute commitment to the destruction of human flesh. It is a messy, exhausting, and deeply personal form of violence. As the laborers grip the wooden and plastic handles of their makeshift weapons, their hands still flick with the residual oil and slime of the day's catch. The psychological threshold was crossed. They moved with a chilling, synchronized purpose, their movements masked by the ever-present roar of the ship's engine. They abandoned their stations in the lower bowels of the vessel and began the slow, deliberate ascent toward the officers' quarters. The physical hierarchy of the ship, which had placed the Korean management above them in perceived safety, now required the laborers to hunt their targets in the enclosed, elevated spaces of the superstructure. The assault began in the dead of night, targeting the Korean officers during their most vulnerable state. Sleep is the ultimate surrender of awareness, and on a vessel like the OMAC, it was the only brief respite from the agonizing reality of the voyage. The officers had retreated to their cabins, relying on the heavy metal doors and the established chain of command to protect them. They were entirely oblivious to the lethal threat ascending the narrow steel stairwells. The laborers moved through the dimly lit passageways, shadows detaching themselves from the damp walls of the ship. When they reached the officer's deck, the violence erupted with a sudden, overwhelming ferocity that shattered the mechanical monotony of the night. The heavy doors, designed to keep out the harsh weather of the open sea, proved utterly useless against the concentrated fury of the uprising. The laborers breached the cabins, plunging the sleeping men into a waking nightmare. The initial moments of the attack were defined by pure, unadulterated shock. The Korean officers were violently pulled from the depths of sleep by the agonizing bite of industrial steel. There was no time to process the situation, no opportunity to issue commands or assert the authority they had wielded just hours before. The impenetrable language barrier that had defined their interactions was rendered entirely irrelevant. The only communication in those cramped cabins was the universal language of physical trauma and primal terror. The tight confines of the sleeping quarters, which had once offered a semblance of privacy and security, instantly transformed into inescapable slaughterhouses. There was simply no room to maneuver, no space to parry the heavy, downward strikes of the meat cleavers or the swinging arcs of the iron hooks. The laborers, fueled by weeks of accumulated rage and the desperate knowledge that failure meant their own deaths, struck with a frenzied, relentless power. For the victims who managed to survive the initial onslaught in their cabins, the nightmare was only just beginning. Panic, pure and blinding, drove them to flee into the ship's narrow corridors. But the OMAC was not designed for escape. It was an industrial cage. The passageways were claustrophobic tunnels of cold, wet steel, barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. The floors were perpetually slick with a treacherous mixture of seawater, leaked machine oil, and the ever-present slime of processed fish. Now, this hazardous surface was further compromised by the sudden, copious spilling of human blood. The fleeing officers found themselves trapped in a horrifying labyrinth, slipping and sliding in the darkness as they desperately searched for a sanctuary that simply did not exist. Every corner turned, every watertight door approached, presented a new, terrifying obstacle. The pursuit through the bowels of the OMAC was an exercise in absolute, suffocating terror. The engine noise, which had previously masked the approach of the attackers, now swallowed the desperate cries for help. The laborers pursued their former masters with relentless determination, the heavy iron hooks scraping against the steel bulkheads, creating a chilling, metallic screech that echoed through the dark corridors. The officers were hunted relentlessly, driven deeper into the ship, or forced outward toward the exposed exterior decks. The violence in the passageways was chaotic and brutal. Every slip, every loss of footing, was met with the devastating impact of the industrial blades. The sheer brutality of the weapons left horrific, deep lacerations, incapacitating the fleeing men and turning the corridors into a grisly, slipping hazard. The very environment that the officers had once controlled with absolute authority had turned into a lethal trap, actively working against their desperate attempts to survive. As the surviving targets were forced out of the interior corridors and onto the open, windswept decks, they were confronted with the most horrifying realization of all. The boundaries of their world were entirely defined by the railing of the ship. Beyond that thin barrier of steel lay the vast, uncaring expanse of the Pacific Ocean. In the pitch black of the night, the water was invisible, a sheer, terrifying void that offered no hope of salvation. The officers were pinned between the advancing line of desperate, armed laborers and the lethal plunge into the abyss. There were no lifeboats prepared, no life preservers readily accessible in the chaos of the ambush. To jump into the freezing, turbulent waters in the middle of the night, hundreds of miles from the nearest landmass, was to accept an agonizing, certain death by drowning or hypothermia. The ocean, which had served as the ultimate shield for their abusive management style, had now become the final, inescapable wall of their execution chamber. Driven to the absolute brink of madness by the approaching blades, some of the victims made the unthinkable choice. Faced with the immediate, visceral horror of the cleavers and the hooks, they abandoned the blood-soaked deck of the OMAC and hurled themselves into the pitch-black void. The drop to the water below was blind and terrifying. The moment their bodies broke the surface of the Pacific, they were instantly swallowed by the darkness and the churning wake of the massive vessel. The ship did not slow down. The engine did not cease its relentless forward march. The men who jumped were left behind in the vast, freezing emptiness, their desperate struggles instantly erased by the indifferent currents of the deep ocean. It was a choice between a violent, bloody demise on the steel deck or a slow, terrifying suffocation in the crushing depths, a horrific testament to the absolute hopelessness of their situation. For those who could not bring themselves to jump, or who were cornered before they could reach the relative mercy of the railing, the end came with brutal, mechanical efficiency. The laborers closed the distance, their weapons rising and falling in the dim light. The sheer trauma inflicted by the heavy industrial tools was catastrophic. The human body is fragile, easily dismantled by implements designed to cut through dense marine bone and muscle. The victims fell to the deck, the life violently separated from their bodies, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. The violence was not surgical or precise. It was the messy, chaotic release of an immense, compressed psychological pressure. The laborers ensured that the threat was completely neutralized, leaving nothing to chance in an environment where any surviving authority figure could mean their own execution upon returning to port. The aftermath of the slaughter was characterized by a chilling, sudden shift in the atmosphere aboard the OMAC. The frenzy of the attack eventually subsided, leaving the surviving laborers standing amidst the catastrophic results of their rebellion. The ship was profoundly altered. The decks, the narrow corridors, and the officers' cabins were heavily painted with the evidence of the massacre. Blood pooled in the rusted indentations of the steel floor plates and mixed with the seawater washing over the exterior decks. 2 or 3 of the commanding officers lay dead, their bodies a testament to the horrific power of the industrial weapons. Several others were severely wounded, their bodies bearing the deep, agonizing marks of the cleavers and the hooks, clinging to life in the dark, filthy corners of the vessel. The absolute authority that had governed the ship just hours before had been completely eradicated, replaced by a heavy, stunned silence that was only broken by the continuous, indifferent rumbling of the ship's engine. To secure their newfound control and to begin the desperate process of obscuring the magnitude of their actions, the mutineers undertook a grim, final task. The bodies of the deceased officers, the men who had once dictated every aspect of their agonizing existence, were dragged across the slippery, blood-soaked deck. With a heavy, collective heave, the laborers hoisted the corpses over the rusted railing and discarded them into the dark, churning waters of the Pacific. It was a cold, pragmatic act of disposal, an attempt to erase the physical evidence of the ultimate crime. The ocean accepted the bodies without a sound, swallowing the victims and their authority, hiding them perfectly beneath miles of freezing, crushing water. The OMAC continued its course through the night, a ghost ship carrying a cargo of traumatized survivors, severely injured men, and a terrible, bloody secret. The vessel was now totally untethered from the laws of civilization, a floating crime scene adrift in the most isolated, unforgiving environment on Earth, slowly making its way back toward the distant, complicated reality of dry land. The arrival of the OMAC into the harbor of Pago Pago was not the triumphant return of a successful fishing expedition, but rather the slow, agonizing crawl of a ghost ship carrying a cargo of unspeakable trauma. As the vessel crested the horizon and began its approach toward the volcanic embrace of American Samoa, it appeared to the casual observer on the docks as just another rusted industrial hull returning from the deep. But as the ship drew closer, the standard maritime protocols seemed to falter. The communication from the bridge was erratic, and the physical state of the ship, even from a distance, hinted at a profound internal collapse. When the OMAC finally made contact with the pier, the atmosphere in the harbor shifted instantly. The sun was bright, reflecting off the turquoise waters of the bay, but a cold shadow seemed to fall over the port the moment the first lines were secured. The transition from the lawless isolation of the open ocean to the rigid, organized reality of a United States territory was about to begin. And it would start with a sensory shock that would haunt the first responders for the rest of their professional lives. The initial boarding of the OMAC by the American Samoa Port Authority and the United States Coast Guard was a standard procedure that rapidly devolved into a descent into a living nightmare. As the officers stepped from the sun-drenched pier onto the steel deck of the vessel, they were immediately hit by a smell that defied the usual odors of a fishing boat. It was the familiar, nauseating stench of industrial fish processing, but underneath it lay something far more sinister: the heavy, metallic, and unmistakable scent of large quantities of decomposing human blood. The exterior decks, though partially washed by seawater and the morning dew, bore the unmistakable dark, rust-colored stains of a violent struggle. It was as if the ship itself was trying to vomit up the secrets of the past few days. The investigators moved with tactical caution, their hands hovering near their sidearms, as they navigated the slippery, gore-streaked surfaces toward the interior of this superstructure. Entering the narrow corridors of the OMAC was like stepping into a tomb. The artificial lighting inside the ship flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the bulkheads. In the cramped passageways, the evidence of the massacre was preserved with horrific clarity. Blood spatter decorated the walls in violent, arcing patterns, reaching heights that told a story of desperate, upright struggles and heavy, swinging impacts. The floors were treacherous, the dried blood creating a tacky, uneven surface that clung to the boots of the investigators. As they moved toward the officers' quarters, the magnitude of the violence became overwhelming. Cabin doors had been hacked at with incredible force, and the interiors were scenes of absolute carnage. Bedding was shredded and soaked through, and the small, confined spaces were littered with the remnants of a life interrupted by extreme trauma. However, the most chilling aspect of the scene was the absence of the bodies. The investigators found the blood, the weapons, and the terror, but the victims themselves had vanished into the void of the Pacific. The jurisdictional complexity of the Omak case immediately became a central pillar of the investigation. Because the crimes had occurred on the high seas hundreds of nautical miles north of American Samoa and international waters, but the vessel had docked in a U.S. territory, the legal machinery of the United States federal government was triggered. This was not a local police matter. It was a maritime atrocity that fell under the purview of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Attorney's Office. The Omak was immediately cordoned off, transformed from a commercial vessel into one of the most complex floating crime scenes in the history of the South Pacific. Forensic teams were flown in, tasked with the grim objective of reconstructing a series of murders without the presence of the deceased. They had to rely on the silent testimony of the blood spatter, the DNA recovered from the rusted cleavers, and iron hooks, and the harrowing physical evidence of the struggle etched into the very steel of the ship. The process of sorting through the survivors was a monumental challenge defined by a wall of silence and an impenetrable language barrier. The crew was a fractured mosaic of nationalities: Vietnamese, Indonesian, and the surviving Koreans. They were separated and moved to secure locations on land, away from the influence of the ship. The investigators faced an immediate hurdle. They were in a remote territory with limited access to certified translators for the specific dialects spoken by the deckhands. The initial interviews were agonizingly slow, conducted through layers of translation that threatened to strip the testimony of its emotional weight and crucial detail. The Vietnamese crew members, including the man who would emerge as a central figure, Nguyen Van Chen, were initially guarded. They were men who had been treated as expendable for months, and their distrust of authority was deep-seated and justified by their experiences at sea. As the forensic teams meticulously documented the blood trails, a chilling narrative began to emerge. The blood patterns were not random. They were a map of a calculated hunt. The investigators could track the movement of the attackers from the lower processing decks up into the command center. They saw where victims had been cornered, where they had fallen, and where their bodies had been dragged toward the railing. The sheer volume of blood found in specific areas allowed the experts to conclude, even without bodies, that the injuries sustained were incompatible with life. The investigation turned into a grim mathematical exercise, calculating the amount of blood lost to prove a murder had occurred. The rusted industrial tools found discarded around the ship, the meat cleavers, and the iron hooks were sent for intensive analysis. Each tool was a reservoir of evidence, holding the microscopic signatures of both the victims and the men who had wielded them with such devastating force. The knot of the investigation, the central tension that would define the entire case, was the discovery of the motive. As the FBI began to break through the silence of the Vietnamese deckhands, the story shifted from a simple case of maritime murder to a complex tragedy of human suffering. The deckhands did not describe a desire for profit or a planned mutiny for the sake of power. Instead, they spoke of a daily existence that was indistinguishable from slavery. They detailed the relentless physical abuse, the deprivation of food and sleep, and the absolute psychological terror inflicted upon them by the Korean management. They spoke of being trapped in a metal box in the middle of the ocean with no hope of rescue, watching their friends and countrymen be broken by the systemic cruelty of the officers. This was the knot that the investigators had to untie: how to reconcile the horrific, visceral brutality of the murders with the profound, systemic victimization that had preceded them. The identification of Nguyen Van Chen and several other Vietnamese crew members as the primary suspects was the result of a painstaking cross-referencing of testimonies. The survivors began to point toward a small group who had led the uprising, men who had finally snapped under the weight of the abuse. Nguyen Van Chen, in particular, became a focal point of the inquiry. His testimony was a harrowing account of the final moments of the OMAC's established order. Through the translators, he described the feeling of being pushed into a corner where the only remaining choice was to kill or be killed. The investigators had to document these statements with extreme care, knowing that the defense would eventually use the history of abuse to argue for a state of temporary insanity or extreme self-defense. The challenge for the prosecution was to prove that while the abuse was real, the response to systematic hunting and slaughter of the officers was a criminal act of murder that exceeded any legal definition of protection. One of the most haunting details uncovered during the investigation was the specific fate of the officers who had jumped overboard. The investigators interviewed the men who had stood on the deck and watched their superiors disappear into the black water. These witnesses described the terrifying silence of the Pacific night, broken only by the splashes and the distant, fading cries of the men left behind. The realization that the ocean had been used as an execution tool added a layer of chilling pragmatism to the crime. There was no way to recover those who had jumped. They were gone, erased by the currents and the depths. This left the investigators with a heavy burden of proof. They had to demonstrate that the suspects had intentionally created the conditions that forced the victims into the water, effectively making the ocean the murder weapon. The physical evidence on the ship continued to yield grim secrets. In the cracks of the floorboards and the hinges of the doors, the forensic teams found minute traces of tissue and bone, evidence of the power behind the cleaver strikes. Each discovery was a piece of a horrific puzzle that, when completed, showed a level of violence that was almost impossible to process. The investigators found themselves working in a state of grim detachment, focusing on the technical data to avoid being overwhelmed by the sheer inhumanity of the scene. They were documenting the collapse of a social structure, the moment when the pressure of isolation and abuse had turned a workplace into a slaughterhouse. The OMAC was not just a crime scene. It was a monument to what happens when human beings are stripped of their rights and their dignity in a place where no one can hear them scream. The final stages of the investigation involved a meticulous reconstruction of the timeline. The FBI had to account for every hour from the moment the first blow was struck to the moment the ship docked in Pago Pago. They had to understand how the mutineers had maintained control of the ship during the long journey back to land, and what had been discussed among the survivors during those quiet, blood-soaked days at sea. The knot tightened as it became clear that the period between the massacre and the arrival in port was one of profound psychological shifts. The suspects had lived with the evidence of their deeds for days, navigating the very ship they had turned into a tomb. This period of reflection and navigation suggested a level of control and intentionality that the prosecution would later use to counter the claims of a spontaneous, uncontrolled outburst of rage. As the investigation drew to a close and the formal charges were prepared, the investigators left the OMAC for the last time. The ship remained moored in Pago Pago, a silent, rusting witness to the darkness that exists in the most isolated corners of the world. The files were thick with photographs of bloodstained steel and transcripts of broken men trying to explain the unexplainable. The case of the OMAC was moving toward the courtroom, but for the men who had spent weeks inside that hollowed-out hull, the investigation would never truly end. They had seen the absolute limit of human endurance and the terrifying speed with which civilization can be discarded when the only law is the law of the deep water. The truth of what happened hundreds of miles north of American Samoa was now a matter of record. But the weight of that truth was a burden that would be felt long after the legal proceedings were over, a reminder that the ocean is a place where secrets are buried deep. But sometimes, the blood of the past refuses to be washed away. The transition from the blood-slick decks of the OMAC to the sterile, air-conditioned confines of a federal courtroom in Pago Pago was a jarring shift that highlighted the immense gap between the law of the sea and the law of the land. When the legal proceedings finally commenced, the atmosphere in American Samoa was thick with a tension that was both local and international. This was not merely a local criminal trial. It was a high-stakes federal inquiry into a maritime atrocity that had occurred in the lawless void of international waters. Because American Samoa is a territory of the United States, the federal judicial system took command, bringing with it the full weight of American maritime law and the constitutional rigors of a capital murder investigation. The courtroom became a theater of clashing narratives, where the brutal reality of deep-sea fishing was scrutinized through the precise, often cold lens of Western jurisprudence. For the people of Pago Pago, a community deeply tied to the tuna industry, the trial was a sobering look into the dark machinery that fueled their economy. For the defendants, it was the first time in their lives that their voices, previously silenced by language barriers and industrial abuse, were forced into the public record. The jurisdictional foundation of the case was the first hurdle the court had to navigate. Under the United States Code, crimes committed by or against American nationals or occurring on vessels that eventually dock in U.S. ports after an incident in international waters fall under the special maritime and territorial jurisdiction of the United States. This legal framework ensured that the Vietnamese crew members, including Nguyen Van Chen, would be tried as if the murders had happened on American soil. However, the distance between the courtroom and the actual site of the crime was hundreds of nautical miles of open ocean, a place where the standard protections of the law are often invisible. The prosecution faced the immense task of proving that a triple homicide had occurred despite the total absence of physical remains. In the eyes of the law, the Pacific Ocean had become an uncooperative witness, hiding the victims and the primary evidence of their deaths. To secure a conviction, the government had to reconstruct the slaughter using nothing but forensic chemistry, blood spatter analysis, and the harrowing, often contradictory testimony of traumatized men who spoke through layers of translation. The prosecution's case was built on the foundation of absolute brutality. They presented the OMAC not as a place of struggle, but as a site of a calculated, predatory hunt. The lead prosecutors laid out a narrative of a night where the social order of the ship was not just challenged, but systematically dismantled through extreme violence. They brought the physical evidence into the courtroom, the heavy industrial meat cleavers and the long, wickedly curved iron hooks. These were not presented as fishing tools, but as murder weapons of terrifying efficiency. The prosecution argued that the decision to use such implements demonstrated a clear intent to inflict maximum suffering and death. They meticulously walked the jury through the forensic maps of the ship, pointing out the blood trails that led from the sleeping quarters to the railings. Their argument was that even if the crew had been mistreated, the response, the hunting of men in their sleep, the hacking of bodies, and the dumping of victims into the sea crossed the line from any recognizable form of self-defense into the realm of cold-blooded, premeditated murder. They emphasized that the mutineers had hours to reconsider their actions as they moved through the ship, yet they chose to continue the slaughter until no officers were left to challenge them. In contrast, the defense team, comprised of federal public defenders, sought to put the ship itself on trial. Their strategy was to transform the OMAC from a fishing vessel into a slave ship, arguing that the defendants were not predators, but victims of a systemic, prolonged psychological and physical breakdown. They argued that the Vietnamese deckhands had been subjected to conditions that would break any human being. The defense brought forward experts in maritime labor and trauma psychology to testify about the broken spirit phenomenon that occurs in isolated, abusive environments. They detailed the months of sleep deprivation, the physical beatings, and the constant threat of being thrown overboard by the Korean officers. According to the defense, the uprising was not a premeditated crime, but a collective, spontaneous explosion of survival instinct. They contended that in the minds of Nguyen Van Chen and his compatriots, the officers were not just managers, but mortal threats who would eventually kill them if they did not act first. The defense's narrative was one of maritime necessity, a desperate attempt to reclaim their humanity from a regime that had stripped it away. One of the most powerful and gut-wrenching segments of the trial involved the testimony of the surviving crew members who had not participated in the violence. Specifically, the Indonesian deckhands were called to the stand. Their presence in the courtroom was a study in profound vulnerability. Through translators, they described the sheer terror of that night, the sound of the meat cleavers hitting wood and bone, the screams that were suddenly cut short, and the sight of their Vietnamese colleagues transformed by rage. These witnesses occupied a middle ground. They had suffered under the same Korean officers, but they had chosen to hide in the dark corners of the ship rather than join the slaughter. Their testimony provided a crucial, objective perspective on the scale of the violence. They described the aftermath, the way the ship smelled of copper and salt, and the chilling silence of the mutineers as they began the long journey back to port. Their accounts served to humanize the victims, reminding the jury that while the officers may have been abusive, they were also human beings who died in a state of unimaginable fear. The forensic testimony was equally chilling, centered on the missing body problem. The prosecution called upon experts who had analyzed the bloodstains found in the cabins of the missing Korean officers. They presented complex calculations to the jury, arguing that the volume and pattern of the blood found on the mattresses and bulkheads were indicative of catastrophic hemorrhaging. The experts testified that based on the arterial spray and the saturation of the materials, it was a medical certainty that the men who had occupied those rooms could not have survived. This scientific reconstruction was intended to bridge the gap left by the Pacific Ocean. If the jury could be convinced that the officers were dead before they ever hit the water, the lack of bodies would no longer be an obstacle to a murder conviction. The defense countered by questioning the precision of these estimates, pointing out that in a damp, salt-heavy environment like a fishing boat, blood can spread and appear more voluminous than it actually is. This technical battle over the chemistry of death became a focal point of the trial's middle weeks. As the trial reached its crescendo, the focus shifted back to Nguyen Van Chen. He was the face of the mutiny, the man whom the prosecution identified as a primary instigator. When he spoke, or when his statements were read, the courtroom was pin-drop silent. His words were a window into a world that most people could never imagine, a world of endless labor, of being hit for not understanding a word in a foreign tongue, and of the growing realization that he would never see his home again if he stayed on that ship. The defense argued that Chen was a man who had been pushed past the point of sanity, his actions a direct result of the hell on water created by the fishing company. However, the prosecution countered by highlighting his actions after the initial outburst. They pointed to the way he helped navigate the ship back to American Samoa, and the way he supposedly coordinated the disposal of the evidence. To the government, this was not the behavior of a man who had lost his mind, but of a man who was cleaning up a crime scene he had carefully created. The jury in Pago Pago was faced with a monumental task. They were a group of local residents, many of whom had relatives working in the canneries or on the docks. They understood the hardships of the sea, but they were also bound by their oath to uphold the federal laws of the United States. The deliberations were long and arduous. The jurors had to weigh the undeniable horror of the massacre against the undeniable horror of the abuse. They had to decide if the slave ship defense was a valid justification for triple homicide and the disposal of bodies at sea. The case touched on deep-seated questions of human rights, maritime sovereignty, and the limits of self-defense. In the end, the jury reached a verdict that reflected the severity of the acts committed on the Omar. While they acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of the abuse, they could not overlook the calculated nature of the hunt and the brutality of the weapons used. The sentencing phase was a somber conclusion to a trial that had already exhausted the emotional reserves of everyone involved. The judge, presiding over the federal court, spoke at length about the unique and terrifying nature of crimes committed on the high seas. He noted that the isolation of the ocean does not grant a license for cruelty, nor does it grant a license for lawless retribution. Nguyen Van Chen and the other primary defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentences were a clear message from the federal government. The American legal system would reach out into the furthest corners of the Pacific to hold men accountable for violence, regardless of the provocations they faced. For the defendants, the verdict meant they would trade one cage for another, moving from the rusted steel of the OMAC to the concrete and iron of a federal penitentiary. The results of the trial left a complex legacy in American Samoa. On one hand, justice had been served for the families of the missing Korean officers, men whose remains would never be recovered from the deep. On the other hand, the trial had exposed a gaping wound in the international fishing industry, a system of labor that bordered on human trafficking and invited the very violence it eventually suffered. The OMAC case became a textbook example for maritime lawyers and human rights advocates, cited in discussions about the need for better regulation and oversight on the high seas. The trial proved that while you can bury a body in the ocean, you cannot bury the truth of what happened on a ship when it finally hits the shore. The legal battle in Pago Pago ended with the slamming of cell doors, but the questions it raised about the value of a human life in the middle of the Pacific Ocean remained unanswered, echoing in the halls of justice long after the OMAC had been sold for scrap and forgotten by the world. The silence that followed the final gavel in the federal courthouse of Pago Pago was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, ringing silence that follows a catastrophic explosion. As the courtroom cleared and the legal teams packed their briefcases, the tragedy of the OMAC did not end. It merely shifted into a new, quieter phase of suffering. Outside the court, the tropical sun of American Samoa continued to beat down on the volcanic peaks and the turquoise waters of the harbor, indifferent to the weight of the life sentences that had just been handed down. The town of Pago Pago, which had served as the accidental stage for this maritime horror, slowly began to turn its attention back to the daily rhythms of the tuna industry, but the shadow of the rusted fishing vessel remained etched into the local consciousness. For the people of the island, the OMAC was no longer just a ship. It was a grim monument of shame, a physical reminder of the darkness that can brew when the world looks the other way. The vessel itself, the OMAC, remained moored in a secluded corner of the harbor for a significant period following the conclusion of the trial. It sat there, a ghost ship of steel and salt, slowly surrendering to the relentless humidity and the corrosive power of the sea air. To look at the ship was to see a map of the tragedy. The rust that bloomed along its hull looked like dried blood, and the mechanical silence of its once roaring engine felt like a profound absence. Eventually, the ship was sold for scrap, stripped of its machinery and its identity, and broken down into anonymous piles of metal. This physical erasure was a pragmatic necessity, but it also felt like a deliberate attempt to bury the evidence of what had happened. However, you cannot truly scrap a memory. The story of what occurred in the dark corridors of that vessel had already permeated the maritime history of the South Pacific, serving as a cautionary tale for every sailor and fisherman who called Pago Pago home. For the men convicted of the slaughter, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a different kind of isolation. Nguyen Van Chen and the other mutineers were moved from the local detention centers to federal penitentiaries on the United States mainland. This was a final, cruel irony of their journey. They had originally left Vietnam in search of a better life, hoping to send money home to their families, only to find themselves trapped in the brutal servitude of the OMAC. Now, they were thousands of miles away from the ocean they had worked, locked inside concrete boxes, far from the salt spray and the horizon. The transition from the lawless freedom of the high seas to the rigid, hyper-regulated environment of a maximum security prison was a total inversion of their existence. In prison, they were surrounded by people but remained utterly alone, separated by language, culture, and the enormity of their crimes. They had traded a floating prison for a stationary one, and the psychological toll of that exchange was a slow, daily erosion of the soul. The human cost of the OMAC tragedy extended far beyond the prison walls and the scrapyards of American Samoa. In South Korea, the families of the missing officers were left with a hollow, echoing grief that offered no possibility of closure. Because the bodies had been surrendered to the Pacific, there were no graves to visit, no traditional rites of passage to mark the end of a life. The ocean, which had provided their loved ones with a livelihood, had become a vast, unmarked cemetery. These families were forced to live with the haunting knowledge of how their fathers and husbands had died hunted and butchered in the dark by the very men they had commanded. The absence of remains meant that the mourning process was frozen in time, a perpetual state of waiting for a return that would never happen. The tragedy of the OMAC was, at its core, a failure of the human connection, leaving a trail of broken families into different countries, separated by a sea that held all the secrets. In Vietnam, the families of the convicted men faced a different but equally devastating reality. They had seen their sons and brothers leave with high hopes, only to receive news of a massacre and life sentences in a foreign land. For many of these families, the nuances of maritime law and the slave ship defense were irrelevant. They only knew that their loved ones were gone, and the economic support they had promised had vanished. There was a sense of profound shame and confusion, a struggle to reconcile the men they knew with the images of the bloodstained mutineers presented in the international media. The OMAC case highlighted the vulnerability of migrant workers in the global fishing industry. Men who are often forced into desperate situations with no legal protection and no way to communicate their distress until it is far too late. The convicted men became symbols of a systemic failure, a warning to other families about the hidden costs of the deep-sea labor market. The legal legacy of the OMAC case continues to be a subject of intense study within the fields of maritime and international law. It served as a landmark instance of the United States exercising its special maritime jurisdiction to prosecute crimes committed in international waters. The trial proved that the lawlessness of the high seas is a myth, and that the long arm of the federal government can reach into the furthest reaches of the Pacific. However, the case also exposed the massive loopholes that allow for the continued abuse of laborers on fishing vessels. The OMAC operated in a world of flags of convenience and minimal oversight, a world where the pressure for profit often outweighs the value of human life. While the individuals were punished, the system that produced the OMAC remained largely intact. The tragedy was a symptom of a larger rot in the global seafood supply chain, a rot that relies on the isolation of the ocean to hide its most egregious sins. Reflecting on the OMAC 25 years later, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of our own connection to the tragedy. The tuna that fills the shelves of our grocery stores often comes from vessels just like the OMAC, where men work in conditions that most people would find intolerable. We are the silent partners in this industry, our demand for cheap protein driving the very pressures that led the Korean officers to become abusers and the Vietnamese deckhands to become killers. The OMAC is a reminder that there is a human face behind every product we consume, and that sometimes the price of our convenience is paid in blood and suffering in the middle of the ocean. The tragedy asks us to look past the label and consider the moral cost of our global economy, a cost that is often hidden beneath the waves. The Pacific Ocean itself remains the ultimate, indifferent witness to the events of March 2001. To the ocean, the OMAC was nothing more than a temporary speck of rust and noise on its vast, blue surface. The blood that spilled on the decks was quickly diluted and dispersed by the currents, and the bodies that were thrown overboard were claimed by the deep without a ripple. The ocean does not judge. It does not take sides in the conflicts of men. It only endures. The OMAC is a story of human rage, despair, and the total collapse of the social contract. But it is also a story about the terrifying scale of the world we live in. We like to think that we have conquered the planet, that our laws and our technology have made the world small and safe. But the OMAC proves that there are still places where the rules don't reach, places where the silence is absolute and the darkness is total. The psychological profile of the OMAC massacre is one of situational madness. It is a study of what happens when a group of people is subjected to extreme, prolonged stress without any hope of escape. The thin line between victim and perpetrator was not just crossed on the OMAC, it was obliterated. We are left with the haunting question of what we would do in the same situation. If we were trapped in a metal box, thousands of miles from home, being beaten and starved by men who saw us as nothing more than machines, would we remain civilized? Or would the primitive instinct for survival take over, turning us into the very thing we fear most? The tragedy of the OMAC is that there were no winners, only survivors who were forever changed by the violence they either inflicted or endured. It is a story that refuses to provide the comfort of a simple moral conclusion. As we look back at this case, we must also acknowledge the role of Pago Pago, The harbor town was a reluctant sanctuary, a place where the madness of the deep sea finally met the order of the land. The people of American Samoa showed a profound sense of community and justice during the trial, grappling with a horror that was not of their making but was brought to their shores. The town remains a hub for the Pacific fishing fleet, and the lessons of the Omak are still whispered in the bars and on the docks where the fishermen gather. It is a reminder that even in the most isolated corners of the world, we are our brother's keepers, and that when we fail in that responsibility, the consequences are catastrophic. The Omak is a part of Pago Pago's history now, a dark thread in the vibrant tapestry of the islands. In the final analysis, the Omak is a ghost story for the modern age. It is a story about the ghosts of the men who died, the ghosts of the lives the mutineers could have had, and the ghosts of an industry that still operates in the shadows. The Pacific Ocean continues to churn hundreds of miles north of American Samoa, its waves hitting the hulls of thousands of other fishing boats just like the Omak. The engine roar continues, the smell of diesel and fish remains, and the pressure to fill the holds never lets up. We can only hope that the memory of the Omak serves as a beacon, a warning to those who would trade human dignity for profit, and a reminder that even in the middle of the vast, uncaring ocean, every life has a value that can never be truly erased. The story of the Omak ends not with a resolution, but with a lingering, haunting question about the nature of humanity in the face of absolute isolation. The Pacific holds the answer buried deep beneath the waves, where the water is cold and the silence is eternal. The passage of time across the Pacific Ocean does not move in the same way it does on land. On the islands and continents, time is marked by the shifting of seasons, the growth of cities, and the rhythmic pulse of human development. But out on the high seas, hundreds of nautical miles from the nearest shore, time is a flat, eternal circle, defined only by the rising and falling of the tide and the indifferent passage of the sun. The tragedy of the Omak, which reached its violent conclusion in the spring of 2001, has now drifted into this eternal realm of maritime history. It has become a narrative fossil, a grim specimen of human behavior preserved in the salt and the deep pressure of the South Pacific. Yet, even 25 years later, the echoes of that night continue to ripple through the world of international fishing, serving as a persistent, low-frequency warning that the conditions which created the Omak have not been fully eradicated. To truly understand the final chapter of this story, one must look beyond the prison walls and the legal verdicts, and instead examine the enduring psychological and industrial landscape that remains in the wake of the massacre. The geographical coordinates where the Omak's establishment of order finally collapsed remain unmarked by any buoy or monument. In the deep water north of Pago Pago, there is nothing but the vast, rolling expanse of the blue. To sail through those waters today is to be struck by the same absolute silence that greeted the mutineers after the slaughter. It is an environment that actively resists human memory. The ocean has a way of absorbing trauma, diluting the evidence of even the most horrific acts until nothing remains but the water itself. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Omak case, the realization that out here, the scale of human tragedy is dwarfed by the scale of the void. The 3 Korean officers who were lost to the deep have become part of that void, their individual identities subsumed by the immense, cold archive of the sea. Their story survives only because a rusted steel hull eventually hit a wooden pier in American Samoa, bringing the secrets of the deep water into the light of the sun. The legacy of the Omak in the harbor of Pago Pago is one of quiet, systemic change. In the years following the trial, local authorities and the international fishing companies were forced to acknowledge the inherent dangers of the invisible fleet. The Omak was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a global industry that operates on the margins of civilization. The case spurred a renewed interest in the living conditions of migrant fishermen, leading to tighter inspections and more rigorous oversight within the territorial waters of the United States. In Pago Pago, the tuna canneries that once accepted the harvest of ships like the Omak with few questions began to implement more stringent protocols for the treatment of crews. There was a collective realization that a happy, healthy crew is not just a moral imperative, but a fundamental requirement for the safety of the ship and the security of the harbor. The town, which depends so heavily on the bounty of the sea, learned the hard way that the cost of cheap labor can sometimes be measured in lives. However, the international landscape beyond the reach of American Samoa remains a challenging frontier. The Flags of Convenience system, which allows ships to register in countries with minimal labor regulations, continues to provide a cloak for the kind of abuse that occurred on the Omak. Thousands of nautical miles away from the watchful eye of the U.S., Coast Guard other vessels are currently navigating the same dark waters, carrying crews who are just as isolated, just as exhausted, and just as desperate as the Vietnamese deckhands of 2001. The Omak serves as the definitive case study for why this system is so dangerous. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that when you remove the protection of the law and the presence of human empathy from a high-pressure environment, the result is an inevitable regression into the most primitive forms of violence. The tragedy remains a foundational text for maritime human rights advocates, a stark reminder that the ocean is not a place for lawlessness, but a place that requires the highest standards of human conduct precisely because it is so unforgiving. For the survivors of the Omak, both the victims who remained on land and the perpetrators who were locked away, the memory of the ship is a permanent, internal fixture. In the federal prisons of the United States, the men who led the mutiny are now aging. Their lives are defined by a different kind of confinement, one that is more structured, but no less absolute than the ship they once called home. One can only imagine the psychological landscape of a man like Nguyen Van Chen, who has spent decades reflecting on the choice he made in the middle of the Pacific. Does he still hear the sound of the industrial engine? Does he still feel the weight of the meat cleaver in his hand? The tragedy of the mutineers is that they sought freedom through violence, only to find themselves in a more permanent cage. They are men caught between two worlds, unable to return to the Vietnam they left behind and unable to ever truly belong to the country that now holds them captive. The psychological phenomenon of maritime psychosis or cabin fever was a major theme in the trial, but its implications go far deeper. The Omak case taught us that isolation does more than just stress the mind. It alters the fundamental perception of reality. When a human being is deprived of external communication and subjected to systemic abuse, the world shrinks until it consists only of the immediate threat and the immediate means of survival. The mutineers did not see themselves as criminals. In the distorted reality of the Omak, they saw themselves as soldiers in a war of survival. This shift in perspective is perhaps the most haunting element of the story. It suggests that the moral compass we take for granted on land is a fragile instrument, easily disrupted by the magnetic pull of isolation and fear. The Omak was a laboratory of human desperation, and the results of that experiment were a terrifying confirmation of our most basic instincts. In the archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Attorney's Office, the files on the Omak are thick with photographs that are now decades old. These images of blood-stained decks and rusted weapons serve as a silent, permanent record of a tragedy that the ocean tried to hide. To look at these photographs today is to be transported back to a specific moment in maritime history, a time when the world was beginning to grapple with the complexities of globalized labor. The Omak was at the center of this transition, a bloody intersection of economic necessity and human frailty. The investigators who boarded the ship in Pago Pago have mostly retired now, but for many of them, the Omak remains the most significant case of their careers. It was a case that challenged their professional skills and their personal resilience, forcing them to look directly into the heart of a darkness that most people will never have to encounter. The families of the Korean officers in South Korea continue to carry a burden that is unique to the families of those lost at sea. In the absence of a grave, their grief has no fixed point. It is a diffuse, ever-present sadness that rises and falls like the tide. The Omak tragedy is a reminder that the ocean is a thief that rarely returns what it takes. The lack of closure for these families is a lingering wound, a testament to the absolute nature of maritime murder. They are the forgotten victims of the Omak, people whose lives were shattered by a conflict they were not a part of, occurring on a ship they had never seen. Their story is a crucial part of the Omak legacy, a reminder that every act of violence on the high seas creates a ripple of suffering that eventually reaches the most distant shores. The Vietnamese community in the United States and abroad also bears the marks of the Omak case. For many, it was a source of profound communal grief and complex shame. It highlighted the desperate measures that some are forced to take in the pursuit of a better life, and the horrific consequences that can follow when those aspirations are met with cruelty and exploitation. The story of the Omak deckhands is a dark chapter in the history of labor migration, a reminder of the need for stronger protections for those who work in the world's most dangerous and isolated industries. It is a story that is told in whispers, a cautionary tale about the perils of the deep water and the high price of a dream. As we conclude this examination of the Omak, we are left with a final, cinematic image of the Pacific Ocean. It is a vast, shimmering expanse of blue, beautiful and terrifying in its absolute scale. Somewhere beneath those waves, the secrets of the Omak are still buried. The ocean has moved on, the currents have shifted, and the ship itself has been reduced to dust. But the story remains a permanent part of the maritime lore of American Samoa. It is a story that demands to be told, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. It is a story about the limits of human endurance, the consequences of unchecked power, and the enduring search for justice in a place where the law of the land often fails to reach. The Omak is no longer a ship. It is a ghost that haunts the international fishing industry. It is a reminder that the isolation of the sea is not an excuse for the abandonment of humanity. As long as there are men and women working in the deep water, the story of the Omak will remain relevant. It is a beacon of sorts, a dark light that warns of the jagged rocks of greed and abuse. The tragedy reminds us that we are all connected, even in the most remote corners of the world, and that the choices we make in the dark will eventually be judged in the light. The Pacific continues to roll on, indifferent to our stories and our laws, but for those who know the history of the Omak, the water will always hold a certain weight, a certain darkness that the sun can never quite reach. This series has attempted to navigate the complex and harrowing waters of the Omak massacre, from the first spark of resentment in the lower decks to the final closing of the prison doors. We have looked at the ship, the victims, the perpetrators, and the legal system that tried to make sense of the chaos. But ultimately, the most important lesson of the Omak is a simple one. Dignity is not a luxury. It is a requirement for peace. When we strip away the dignity of others, we pave the way for our own destruction. The Omak was a ship that lost its way long before the first blow was struck. It was a ship that had abandoned its humanity, and in the end, that was its true undoing. The story of the Omak is a tragedy of the deep water, but its lessons are firmly rooted on the land, where the heart of justice beats and the memory of the fallen is preserved. The ocean may hold the bodies, but the truth belongs to us, and it is a truth that we must never allow to be swallowed by the waves. This is the end of the line for the Omak, but the journey of understanding the human condition in the face of such darkness is a voyage that never truly ends. The Pacific is wide, the night is long, and the story of the Omak remains a cold, hard fact in the middle of a vast and liquid world. The finality of a maritime tragedy is rarely found in the closing of a courtroom door or the locking of a cell. Instead, it resides in the persistent, rhythmic churning of the ocean that eventually washes away the names, the blood, and the very memory of the steel that once dared to cross its surface. As we look back on the narrative of the Omak, 25 years after the fact, we are left to grapple with the most uncomfortable truth of all, that the conditions which birthed this massacre were not unique to one ship or one specific crew. The Omak was a concentrated microcosm of a global system that continues to operate in the blind spots of human conscience. To stand on the edge of the harbor in Pago Pago today is to look out at an ocean that appears serene and infinite. But for those who know the history of the year 2001, that water will always carry a hidden weight. The Pacific is not just a body of water. It is a vast, liquid archive of every indignity suffered by men who had no other choice but to sell their labor to the deep. The psychological footprint of the Omak remains embedded in the soil of American Samoa, a place that serves as a bridge between the wild lawlessness of the high seas and the structured order of Western civilization. The residents of the island, many of whom have spent their lives working in the orbit of the tuna industry, speak of the ship as one would speak of a ghost. It is a story told in the quiet hours, a reminder that the prosperity of the port is built on a foundation of grueling, often invisible work. The Omak taught Pago that the ocean can bring more than just a harvest. It can bring the distilled essence of human desperation. The investigation and the trial were not just legal exercises. They were a collective trauma for a community that prides itself on hospitality and faith. The sight of that rusted, blood-stained hull moored in their harbor for so many months became a symbol of a world that had gone horribly wrong. A world where the lines between protector and predator had been completely erased. When we consider the men like Nguyen Van Chen, who are now growing old in federal prisons far removed from the scent of the sea, we must confront the concept of oceanic justice in the middle of the Pacific, where no police can hear you and no laws can reach you. The human mind reverts to a state of nature that is both terrifying and logical. The mutineers did not act out of a desire for evil. They acted out of a distorted, desperate belief that violence was the only language left to them. The tragedy is that this violence, while it ended their immediate suffering at the hands of the Korean officers, ultimately destroyed their lives just as effectively as the abuse had. They sought to reclaim their humanity through an act of supreme inhumanity, and the result was a permanent exile from the world they were trying to save. Their stories are a testament to the fact that on the open ocean, the greatest danger is not the weather or the waves, but the slow, corrosive loss of the self. The 3 Korean officers who were lost to the deep remain the silent center of this tragedy. Their absence is a permanent void that can never be filled by legal verdicts or forensic reports. In the narrative of true crime, there is often a tendency to focus on the perpetrators, to analyze their motives and their backgrounds until the victims become secondary figures. But the Omak reminds us that every act of violence has a physical, visceral cost. These men were fathers, husbands, and sons who died in a state of absolute terror, their bodies discarded as if they were nothing more than the scrap metal of the ship they once commanded. The fact that they were abusive managers does not diminish the horror of their deaths. Rather, it adds a layer of tragic irony to the story. They were victims of the very system of fear they helped to maintain, proving that cruelty is a cycle that eventually consumes everyone involved. The ocean holds them now, a final, cold resting place that offers no answers and no apologies. The forensic investigation into the Omak remains a masterpiece of maritime detective work, a chilling example of how science can reconstruct a massacre without a single body. The investigators who walked through those blood-soaked corridors were forced to become observers of the unimaginable. They saw how the industrial tools of a fishing boat, the cleavers, the hooks, the knives had been repurposed for a different kind of harvest. They documented the way the blood had pooled in the rusted indentations of the steel, creating a map of a hunt that had lasted for hours. For these professionals, the Omak was not just a case. It was a sensory assault that changed their understanding of human capacity for violence. They carried the images of that ship back to their offices and their homes, a burden of proof that went far beyond the requirements of the courtroom. They were the ones who had to bridge the gap between the silence of the Pacific and the noise of the legal system, ensuring that the truth was not lost to the waves. The legacy of the Omak is also found in the evolution of maritime labor laws, though the progress has been agonizingly slow. The case is still cited in international forums as a primary example of why the invisible fleet needs to be brought into the light. It forced a conversation about the rights of migrant workers and the responsibilities of the companies that profit from their labor. Yet, for every step forward, there are still thousands of ships operating in the shadows, where the same pressures of debt, isolation, and language barriers continue to simmer. The Omak was a warning that went unheeded by many, a flare fired into the night sky that was seen by few and ignored by most. The tragedy reminds us that as long as we prioritize the price of a product over the dignity of the person who produced it, we are complicit in the conditions that lead to such horrors. As we reach the final reflection on this case, we must acknowledge the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Pacific Ocean. It is a place that defies human comprehension, a vastness that makes our laws and our conflicts seem insignificant. To the ocean, the OMAC was a transient event, a minor disruption in its eternal movement. But to the families in Vietnam, Korea, and Indonesia, it was the end of the world. This disconnect between the indifference of nature and the intensity of human suffering is the true heart of the OMAC story. We live in a world that is increasingly connected by technology and trade, yet we remain profoundly disconnected from the reality of those who operate on the margins of our global society. The OMAC was a bridge that failed, a vessel that carried the worst of humanity into the most beautiful and terrifying place on Earth. The silence of the Pacific is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a witness who will never speak, a silence that hides the screams of the past and the secrets of the present. When we tell the story of the OMAC, we are attempting to break that silence, to give a voice to the victims and a face to the perpetrators. We are trying to make sense of a night when the world turned upside down, and the only law that mattered was the law of the deep water. The story is a cold, hard fact, a piece of rusted steel that refuses to be forgotten. It reminds us that even in the most isolated corners of the world, we are responsible for each other. When we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us, we are all diminished, and the consequences of that failure can be seen in the blood-stained decks of a ghost ship drifting toward the shore. The OMAC has long since been dismantled, its metal repurposed for other things, but its spirit remains a part of the maritime lore of the South Pacific. It is a story that fishermen tell each other as the sun goes down and the horizon disappears into the dark. It is a warning about the dangers of the heart, the perils of isolation, and the terrifying speed with which civilization can be discarded. The ocean continues to roll, its waves hitting the shores of American Samoa with a rhythmic, indifferent power. The water is clear, the air is salt-heavy, and the sky is infinite. But beneath that beauty lies the memory of a night when the ocean was a witness to a slaughter, and a ship called the OMAC became a synonym for horror. In the end, we are left with the image of the horizon. To the crew of the OMAC, the horizon was a wall, a boundary they could never cross, a reminder of everything they had lost. To the investigators, the horizon was a starting point, the place where the mystery began. And to us, the horizon is a limit of our understanding, a place where the facts of the case meet the mysteries of the human soul. We can analyze the blood spatter, we can study the trial transcripts, and we can map the journey of the ship. But we can never truly know what was in the hearts of those men as they moved through the dark corridors with their cleavers and their hooks. We can only look out at the water and remember that somewhere out there, hundreds of miles north of Pago Pago, the ocean is still keeping its secrets. This final meditation on the OMAC is a tribute to the complexity of justice and the endurance of memory. It is a story that has no happy ending, no easy resolution, and no simple moral. It is a story of blood and salt, of steel and silence. As the final words of this narrative are spoken, the image of the OMAC fades into the gray mist of history, leaving behind only the sound of the waves and the heavy, lingering weight of the truth. The Pacific remains vast and uncaring, a liquid graveyard for the dreams of men and the victims of their rage. We close the book on the OMAC, but we keep its lessons close, knowing that as long as the ocean is wide and the nights are long, the possibility of such a tragedy will always remain, lurking just beneath the surface of our civilized world. The story of the OMAC is over, but the silence it left behind will echo for as long as men dare to sail into the deep, dark heart of the Pacific. This is the last word on a vessel that became a tomb, and a tragedy that became a legend. The water is deep, the secrets are many, and the OMAC is finally at rest, surrendered to the infinite, uncaring embrace of the sea. The physical memory of a crime is often preserved in the most mundane of places, tucked away in the temperature-controlled silence of government archives or the dusty basements of local courthouses. In the case of the OMAC, the paper trail is immense, a mountainous collection of legal filings, forensic photographs, and translated transcripts that together form a heavy, bureaucratic tombstone for a tragedy that the ocean tried to swallow whole. To open these files today is to step back into a world of 2001, a time when the digital age was just beginning to reach the remote corners of the South Pacific. The photographs are grainy, the colors slightly muted by time, yet the vivid, dark stains on the steel decks of the OMAC remain as shocking now as they were 25 years ago. These documents are the only remains left of the 3 Korean officers, the only physical proof that they once lived, worked, and eventually died in a place where the sun sets into a void of water. But beyond the paper and the ink, there is a lingering human narrative that was never fully captured by the court, a story of the survivors who were neither the hunters nor the hunted, but the witnesses to a horror they could never unsee. To understand the full scope of the OMAC's shadow, we must look closer at the Indonesian crew members, the men who occupied the narrow, terrifying middle ground during the night of the slaughter. These men were trapped in a psychological purgatory, caught between the brutal authority of the Korean management and the explosive, lethal rage of their Vietnamese colleagues. In the transcripts of the trial, their voices often sound distant and hollowed out by shock. They were the ones who hid in the pitch-black corners of the ship, listening to the metallic screech of the iron hooks and the desperate, fading cries of their superiors. They were the ones who saw the blood on the walls of the corridors as they were forced, under the threat of death, to help clean the ship in the days that followed. These survivors returned to their homes in Indonesia carrying a burden of guilt and trauma that no legal verdict could ever alleviate. They were not perpetrators, but they were not entirely innocent in the eyes of their own consciences, haunted by the fact that they had stood by while men were butchered just a few feet away. Their silence in the courtroom was not a lack of memory, but a refusal to relive a nightmare that had already claimed their peace of mind. The ripple effect of the OMAC also traveled thousands of miles west, reaching the rural villages of Vietnam where the mutineers had once been celebrated as the family's greatest hope for prosperity. In these communities, the news of the life sentences was a catastrophic blow that transcended the individuals involved. The money that had been promised to build homes, educate children, and support elderly parents evaporated overnight, replaced by the heavy, social weight of a criminal conviction. The families of men like Nguyen Van Chan were forced to confront a reality that was entirely at odds with the men they knew. They had to reconcile the image of the hardworking son who sent home letters of hope with the image of the man who wielded a meat cleaver in the middle of the Pacific. This cultural trauma created a deep, unspoken fear within these communities about the deep sea, a place that was now viewed as a devourer of sons and a destroyer of families. The economic desperation that drove the men to the OMAC in the first place did not go away. It simply found new, equally dangerous avenues, proving that the tragedy of the ship was just one chapter in a much larger story of global inequality and human cost. In the realm of maritime law, the OMAC continues to serve as a pivotal teaching case for federal prosecutors and law enforcement agencies. It is frequently cited as the definitive example of the no-body homicide, a legal rarity that challenges the very foundations of criminal proof. The prosecution's success in securing life sentences without a single physical remains of the victims was a landmark achievement that relied heavily on the intersection of forensic science and maritime jurisdiction. It proved that in the eyes of the law, the ocean is not a loophole, and that the absence of a body does not equate to the absence of a crime. Law students today study the OMAC to understand the complexities of corpus delicti and the power of circumstantial evidence when it is supported by rigorous DNA analysis and expert testimony. The case showed that blood, when interpreted through the lens of modern science, can speak louder than a witness and more clearly than a confession. The OMAC effectively closed the gap between the lawless high seas and the regulated territory of the United States, sending a clear message to the international fishing fleet that the Pacific is not a place where you can hide a murder. Yet, as we reflect on the legal triumphs, we must also acknowledge the physical fate of the vessel itself. The steel of the OMAC, which had absorbed the blood of the victims and the sweat of the mutineers, was eventually fed back into the industrial machine. When the ship was scrapped, the physical scene of the crime was obliterated, turned into anonymous slag, and recycled into new structures, new ships, and new tools. This process of physical disintegration mirrors the way the industry tries to move past its own tragedies. The OMAC was a liability, a reminder of a system that had failed, and its destruction was a way for the fishing companies to turn the page. But for those who study the industry, the OMAC is a ghost that cannot be so easily discarded. It represents a persistent flaw in the global economy, a flaw that relies on the extreme isolation of maritime labor to maintain low costs and high yields. The ship may be gone, but the conditions that led to its demise are still very much alive, lurking in the shadows of the flags of convenience and the unregulated waters of the world. The psychological legacy of the OMAC is perhaps its most enduring and disturbing aspect. It forces us to confront the banality of evil in an industrial context. The Korean officers were not monsters in their daily lives. They were men operating within a brutal system that rewarded cruelty and ignored suffering. The Vietnamese mutineers were not inherently violent men. They were laborers who were pushed into a state of primitive survival by a total lack of legal and human protection. The OMAC was a tragedy of circumstance as much as it was a tragedy of action. It showed us that under the right or rather, the wrong conditions, any human being is capable of the unthinkable. The thin veneer of civilization that we carry with us is easily stripped away by the salt, the dark, and the absolute silence of the open ocean. This is the true horror of the OMAC, not just what happened on the ship, but what it says about the fragility of the human soul when it is untethered from the world of men and left to the mercies of the deep. The Pacific Ocean, for its part, remains the ultimate arbiter of the story. It is a vast, blue witness that has seen thousands of ships like the OMAC pass over its surface, and it will see thousands more. To the ocean, the year 2001 was just another moment in an infinite timeline of waves and currents. The 3 Korean men who were returned to the sea are now part of its eternal cycle, their atoms dispersed and their stories simplified by the immense pressure of the depths. There is a certain grim beauty in this finality, a sense that the ocean is the only entity large enough to hold such a massive amount of suffering without being overwhelmed. As we look out at the horizon from the docks of Pago Pago, we are reminded that we are only ever visitors to the deep water. The laws we write and the verdicts we deliver are small things compared to the power of the tide, but they are the only tools we have to keep the darkness at bay. As this narrative finally comes to a close, we are left with a sense of profound exhaustion, a reflection of the exhaustion felt by the men on the OMAC before the first blow was struck. The story of the massacre is a heavy burden to carry, a complex mixture of empathy, horror, and a desperate search for meaning. We have followed the ship from its birth in the industrial yards to its bloody end in the South Pacific and its final disappearance in the scrap heaps. We have listened to the voices of the investigators, the lawyers, the survivors, and the silent cries of the victims. And in the end, we are left with a quiet, persistent question about the future of the human race in an increasingly disconnected world. The OMAC was a symptom of a global illness, an illness that prioritizes profit over people and isolation over accountability. Until we address the root causes of that illness, the ghosts of the OMAC will continue to haunt the high seas, waiting for the next ship to lose its way in the dark. The final image of this long and harrowing journey is not one of violence, but of the morning sun rising over the harbor of American Samoa. The light hits the volcanic peaks, the palm trees, and the calm, clear water of the bay. It is a beautiful scene, one that suggests peace and reconciliation. But if you look closely at the water, you can see the ripples where the ships come and go, carrying their cargoes and their crews to the furthest reaches of the world. And if you listen closely to the wind, you might hear the faint, echoing sound of a ship's engine, a mechanical heartbeat that never stops, a reminder that somewhere out there, the story is beginning all over again. The OMAC is gone, but the Pacific remains, and the struggle to remain human in the face of absolute isolation is a voyage that never truly reaches its destination. We walk away from the story now, leaving the bloodstained steel and the missing men to the history books and the deep water, forever changed by what we have seen and heard in the shadow of the OMAC. The case of the OMAC massacre stands as a permanent fixture in the history of true crime, not because of the number of victims, but because of the absolute purity of the terror it represents. It is the definitive maritime horror story, a reality that exceeded the most dark imaginations of fiction. It taught us that the ocean is not a void, but a mirror, reflecting back at us the very best and the very worst of what we are. As the final words of this series are recorded, the silence of the room feels like the silence of the Pacific, heavy, expectant, and filled with the weight of the untold stories that still lie beneath the waves. We have done our best to honor the truth of what happened on that ship, to bring the victims into the light and to hold the perpetrators to the standards of our shared humanity. The OMAC is finally at rest, a ghost of the year 2001, and we are left to navigate the waters of the present with the lessons of the past as our only guide. The night is long, the sea is wide, and the memory of the OMAC is a cold, bright star in the dark sky of our collective conscience. The finality of a podcast, much like the finality of a legal sentence, provides a sense of closure that is often entirely absent from the lives of those who actually inhabited the tragedy. We have spent hours navigating the dark corridors of the OMAC, tracing the blood-stained paths from the processing decks to the railings, and sitting in the air-conditioned silence of the federal courtroom in Pago Pago. But as we reach the conclusion of this series, we are forced to realize that the story of the OMAC does not belong to the investigators, the lawyers, or even to us as observers. It belongs to the deep, blue silence of the Pacific Ocean, a place that remembers everything and reveals nothing. The year 2001 is now a distant point on the horizon of history, a flickering light that is slowly being swallowed by the vastness of time. Yet, the lessons of that ship remain as sharp and jagged as the meat cleavers used in the slaughter. A reminder that the thin veneer of our civilization is only as strong as the social contracts we maintain in the most isolated corners of our world. The OMAC was never just a fishing vessel. It was a crucible. It was a place where the most extreme pressures of the global economy were forced into the smallest possible space. When we look back at the evidence, we see a ship that was functioning exactly as the industrial system intended until the very moment it exploded. The Korean officers were doing their jobs by maximizing the catch, and the Vietnamese deckhands were doing theirs by enduring the unendurable. The tragedy occurred because the system had no safety valve for the human spirit. There was no mechanism to account for the dignity of a man who is being beaten in the middle of the ocean, and there was no protocol for the rage that inevitably follows such treatment. The OMAC serves as a permanent warning that when we treat human beings as mere components of a machine, we should not be surprised when that machine eventually turns on its operators. In the federal penitentiaries where Nguyen Vinh Chen and his fellow mutineers now reside, the ocean is a memory that has been replaced by concrete and iron. These men, who once navigated the most vast and open space on Earth, are now confined to the most restricted. There is a profound and heavy irony in their fate. They kill to escape a floating prison, only to find themselves in a permanent one. Their lives are now a series of quiet, regulated moments far removed from the roar of the industrial engine and the smell of the salt spray. They are the living ghosts of the Omar, men who are legally alive but socially and geographically erased. Their stories are rarely told in the halls of power, and their names are fading from the public consciousness, but their presence remains a cold fact in the ledger of the American justice system. They are the human cost of a night when the rules of the land finally reached out and claimed the lawless deep. The survivors who were neither killers nor victims, the Indonesian crew members, carry perhaps the most complex burden of all. They returned to their villages as men who had seen the absolute limit of human depravity. In the quiet of their own lives, they must still hear the echoes of the cleavers hitting the steel and the splashes of the bodies hitting the water. They are the silent witnesses who remind us that trauma is not always loud. Sometimes it is a persistent, low-frequency hum that stays with you forever. They were the ones who had to navigate the blood-slicked decks in the days after the massacre, forced by the mutineers to maintain the very ship that had become a slaughterhouse. Their survival is a testament to the resilience of the human mind, but it is also a reminder of the permanent scars that such a survival leaves behind. They are the forgotten voices of the OMAC, men whose testimony helped secure justice but whose peace was a casualty of the voyage. For the families of the Korean officers, the Pacific Ocean will always be a place of theft. In the 25 years since the massacre, they have had to build a life around an absence that has no physical marker. There is no headstone to touch, no site to visit, and no final remains to bring home. Their grief is as vast and unmarked as the water where their loved ones disappeared. This is the ultimate cruelty of maritime murder. It deprives the living of the basic human right to say a final goodbye. The names of the officers Lee Kim and the others are preserved in the court records, but their spirits are lost to the deep. Their families are the ones who truly pay the price for the isolation of the fishing industry, left to wonder about the final moments of men who were hundreds of miles from help and thousands of miles from home. The town of Pago Pago has moved on, as all port towns must. The harbor remains a hive of activity, with ships from all over the world coming and going, their hulls scarred by the same salt and their crews enduring the same long nights. The OMAC is no longer moored at the pier, but its shadow remains. The investigators and lawyers who handled the case have moved on to other trials and other tragedies. But many of them still find themselves looking out at the horizon and thinking of the ship that arrived with a cargo of secrets. They remembered the smell of the blood and the look in the eyes of the Vietnamese deckhands, a look that spoke of a despair so deep that even a life sentence felt like a form of release. The OMAC changed the way American Samoa viewed the fishing fleet, bringing a sense of sobering reality to an industry that is often romanticized or ignored. The legacy of the OMAC in international maritime law is one of slow, incremental progress. The case proved that the high seas are not a vacuum where crimes can be committed with impunity. It set a precedent for the use of forensic science in the absence of a body, showing that the truth can be reconstructed from the smallest traces of blood and DNA. But while the law has evolved, the industry remains a challenging frontier. The flags of convenience still fly, and the pressure to fill the holds still drives men to the brink of madness. The OMAC was a flare fired into the night, a warning that the world chose to see but has not yet fully acted upon. As long as there are men working in total isolation without the protection of the law, the potential for another OMAC remains a chilling reality. As we reach the final minutes of this podcast, we are left with the image of the Pacific Ocean at dawn. It is a scene of incredible beauty and peace, a vast expanse of blue that seems to hold no darkness at all. But we know better now. We know that beneath that surface lies a history of blood and salt, of steel and silence. We know that the ocean is a witness that never speaks, and a grave that never closes. The story of the OMAC is a reminder that our world is much larger and more dangerous than we often care to admit, and that the comforts of our modern lives are often built on the suffering of those we never see. It is a story that asks us to look past the horizon and consider the humanity of those who operate in the dark, and to remember that no man is so far away that his cries do not matter. The OMAC massacre was a tragedy of the year 2001, but its echoes are eternal. It was a story of 3 men who died in terror, and a group of men who killed in despair. It was a story of an ocean that swallowed the evidence and a legal system that refused to let the truth be buried. As we sign off, we are left with the sound of the waves hitting the shore in Pago Pago, a rhythmic, persistent reminder that the sea goes on, indifferent to our laws and our grief. The OMAC is gone, its steel recycled, and its name forgotten by most, but its lesson remains. We are our brother's keepers, even in the middle of the Pacific, and when we forget that, we are all lost in the deep water. This has been the story of the OMAC, a journey into the heart of maritime darkness, and a search for justice in a place where the sun sets into a void. The final word of this series is not one of judgment, but of remembrance. We remember the victims who have no graves, we remember the perpetrators who have no freedom. And we remember the witnesses who have no peace. The OMAC is a ghost ship now, sailing through the archives of our collective memory, a reminder of what happens when we lose our way in the vastness of the world. The Pacific remains infinite and blue, a mirror that reflects back to us both our greatest achievements and our deepest shamus. As the light fades on this narrative, we leave the OMAC to the history books and the ocean, a cold, hard fact in the middle of a liquid world. The night is long, the sea is wide, and the story of the OMAC is finally told. May we never have to tell a story like it again, and may the silence of the deep water never again be broken by the sound of a meat cleaver in the dark. The true ending of the OMAC story is found in the quiet moments of reflection that follow such a harrowing account. It is in the realization that the world is a complex and often cruel place, and that justice is a fragile human invention that we must constantly fight to maintain. The OMAC was a failure of justice at sea that was eventually addressed by justice on land, but the gap between the two remains a dangerous space where men continue to work and suffer. We hope that by telling this story, we have helped to bridge that gap in some small way, to bring the reality of the deep-sea fishing industry into the light and to honor the humanity of everyone involved. The OMAC is a part of us now, a dark thread in our understanding of the world, and a reminder that even in the most isolated places, we are never truly alone as long as we remember each other. The final cinematic image of our series is the Pago Pago Harbor at sunset. The volcanic peaks are silhouetted against a sky of orange and purple, and the lights of the town are beginning to flicker on. The fishing boats are coming in, their engines thrumming in the quiet air. It is a scene of peace and prosperity, a testament to the endurance of the island and its people. But out on the horizon, where the sky meets the sea, the darkness is already gathering. And somewhere out there, hundreds of miles to the north, the water is still moving over the place where the OMAC once sailed, a vast and uncaring witness to the secrets of the deep. The story is over, the podcast is done, and the OMAC is at rest. This is the end of the line. Good night, and may the sea always be kind to those who sail upon it. The passage of decades has a curious way of smoothing over the jagged edges of a tragedy, turning the visceral, blood-soaked reality of a crime into a series of footnotes, archives, and whispered legends. In the case of the OMAC, the 25 years that have passed since that horrific night in March of 2001 have transformed the mutiny from a breaking news story into a foundational myth of the South Pacific maritime industry. To visit Pago Pago today is to encounter a town that has absorbed the memory of the OMAC into its very bones, yet the physical evidence of the ship has long since vanished. The pier where the vessel once sat, oozing the secrets of its dark voyage, is now occupied by modern, high-tech trawlers and industrial transporters that look nothing like the rusted, industrial predator of the early millennium. But for those who know where to look in the quiet corners of the harbor authorities' filing rooms or the back alleys of the fishing docks, the ghost of the OMAC is still very much present, a cold, salt-heavy presence that refuses to be fully exorcised by the passage of time. If you were to walk through the evidence lockers of the federal authorities in American Samoa today, you might find the final, silent remnants of the OMAC's establishment of order. There, tucked away in heavy plastic bags and sealed boxes, are the industrial meat cleavers and the iron hooks that were once the instruments of a slaughter. These objects have been stripped of their utility and their blood, yet they retain a terrifying, heavy energy. To look at them is to realize that these were not just tools. They were the physical manifestation of a psychological breaking point. The metal is pitted by the salt air, and the wooden handles are worn smooth by the grip of men who were driven to the absolute brink of human endurance. These items serve as a bridge between the sterile world of the courtroom and the chaotic, lawless world of the open ocean. They are the only things that returned from the voyage unchanged, silent witnesses to the screams and the splashes that the Pacific has long since forgotten. The investigators who first boarded the OMAC in Pago Pago are now men and women in the winter of their lives. For many of them, the OMAC was the case that defined their careers, not because of its complexity, but because of its sheer, unadulterated inhumanity. In private conversations, they speak of the smell of the ship, a mixture of diesel, old fish, and the copper tang of human blood that stayed in their nostrils for months after the investigation ended. They describe the psychological toll of walking through those narrow, dark corridors, knowing that every inch of the steel had been a site of a desperate, losing struggle. For these professionals, the Olam was a reminder that the ocean is a place where the thin veneer of civilization can be discarded in an instant, and that the laws they swore to uphold are only as strong as the people who enforce them. They carry the weight of the missing Korean bodies with them, a nagging, unresolved chord in the symphony of their professional achievements. The sociological impact of the OMAC on the Vietnamese diaspora is a story that is rarely told in the mainstream media, yet it remains a profound and painful chapter for the communities involved. For years after the trial, the OMAC mutiny was a shadow that hung over the Vietnamese fishing community, a source of complicated shame and offensive silence. It forced a conversation about the lengths to which migrant workers are pushed and the horrific choices they are forced to make when they are abandoned by the systems that should protect them. In the small coastal towns of Vietnam where the mutineers originated, the story of the OMAC became a cautionary tale, a grim warning about the dark blue economy that promises wealth, but often delivers only tragedy. The families of the convicted men live in a state of permanent, quiet mourning. Their lives defined by a void that can never be filled by the letters that arrive from federal prisons thousands of miles away. In the broader context of the international fishing industry, the OMAC is a case study in the failure of regulation and the persistence of abuse. While the trial in Pago Pago resulted in justice for the specific crimes committed, it did little to change the systemic rot that allowed the conditions on the OMAC to flourish in the first place. Today, the invisible fleet still operates in the shadows of the high seas, with thousands of men working on vessels that are essentially sovereign islands of lawlessness. The flags of convenience still fly, and the pressure to meet global quotas still drives managers to brutality and laborers to desperation. The OMAC was a flare fired into the night, a brief moment of visibility for a world that prefers to remain hidden. The tragedy reminds us that as long as our global supply chains rely on the exploitation of the vulnerable, the possibility of another OMAC is always just over the horizon. The Pacific Ocean, for its part, continues to do what it has always done. It endures. To the ocean, the year 2001 was a mere heartbeat, a transient disturbance on its surface that has long since been smoothed away by the waves. The 3 Korean men who were surrendered to the deep are now a part of the vast, liquid silence that covers 2/3 of our planet. There is a certain terrifying beauty in this lack of memory, a sense that the ocean is the only entity large enough to hold the full scale of human suffering without being destroyed by it. When we look out at the water from the cliffs of American Samoa, we are reminded that we are only ever visitors to the deep, and that the laws we write on land are small, fragile things compared to the ancient, indifferent power of the tide. The OMAC is a ghost in the water, a story that we tell to make sense of the darkness, but the ocean remains the only true witness to what happened in the dark. The final legacy of the OMAC is one of unresolved justice. While the mutineers were sentenced and the ship was scrapped, the fundamental questions raised by the massacre remain unanswered. How do we protect those who work in the most isolated places on Earth? How do we hold corporations accountable for the abuse that happens in their names? And what does it say about us as a global society that we allow such a system to exist? These are the questions that the OMAC leaves behind, a heavy, uncomfortable inheritance for the next generation of maritime advocates and human rights leaders. The tragedy is not just a story of a night of violence. It is a story of a world that failed to look after its own, and the horrific consequences that followed when the light was finally turned on. As we reach the conclusion of this long and harrowing journey, we are left with a cinematic image of the Pago Pago harbor at night. The lights of the town reflect off the black water, and the sound of the ocean hitting the sea wall is a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the harbor lights, the Pacific is rolling on, carrying its secrets and its shadows into the future. The OMAC is gone, its steel long since melted down and repurposed, but its story remains a permanent fixture in the maritime lore of the islands. It is a story of blood and salt, of rage and despair, and of the enduring search for a humanity that is often lost in the deep water. We close the files on the OMAC now, but we keep the lessons of the ship close to our hearts, knowing that the ocean is wide, the night is long, and the struggle to remain human in the face of absolute isolation is a voyage that never truly ends. The psychological profile of the OMAC massacre is a study in compressed trauma. It is what happens when the human spirit is put into an environment where there is no hope, no escape, and no mercy. The mutineers did not wake up one day and decide to become killers. They were slowly, methodically stripped of their humanity until violence was the only thing they had left. This is the true horror of the case, not just the acts themselves, but the systematic destruction of the self that preceded them. It forces us to ask what we are capable of when our own humanity is threatened, and whether any of us could truly say we would act differently if we were trapped in that rusted metal cage in the middle of the Pacific. The OMAC is a mirror reflecting back at us the most uncomfortable truths about our own nature and the fragility of the social contracts that keep us safe. The silence that now surrounds the OMAC is a choice. We choose to remember it through podcasts and true crime reports, but the world at large has largely chosen to forget. It is easier to think of the OMAC as a freak occurrence, a one-time explosion of madness that has no connection to our daily lives. But the truth is that the OMAC was a product of our world, a direct result of the choices we make about what we value and what we are willing to ignore. The story of the ship is a reminder that there is no such thing as a lawless space. There are only spaces where we have chosen not to look. The OMAC is a call to action, a demand that we bring the light of justice into the darkest corners of our global systems, and that we never again allow a ship to become a tomb because we were too busy to notice. As the final words of this series are recorded, the air in the room feels heavy with the weight of the story. We have traveled a long way from the initial reports of a mutiny to the final reflections on the nature of the sea. We have seen the best and the worst of humanity, and we have navigated the complex waters of law, ethics, and survival. The OMAC is finally at rest, a ghost of the year 2001, and we are left to carry its memory forward. May the story of the OMAC serve as a beacon for those who sail in the dark, and a reminder to those of us on land that the ocean is never as far away as it seems. The water is deep, the secrets are many, and the truth of the OMAC is finally told. The final sound we are left with is not the scream of a victim or the roar of an engine, but the sound of the Pacific itself, a vast, indifferent, and eternal movement of water. It is a sound that has existed long before the OMAC and will exist long after we are gone. It is the sound of the void, a place that holds all our stories and yet remains entirely unchanged by them. In that sound, we find the true finality of the OMAC. It is over. The ship is gone. The men are either dead or imprisoned. The archives are closed, but the ocean remains, a blue horizon that hides everything and reveals nothing, a permanent witness to the fact that on the open water, we are all just shadows passing through the deep. This is the end of the line for the OMAC and the end of our journey into its dark, salt-stained heart. The Pacific is wide, the night is long, and the story of the OMAC is finally and forever a part of the sea.